Imagine the world not as it is now, but as it was over 1,000 years ago. A world where the sun rose slowly, reluctantly, and fell again far too soon. A world where breath lingered in the air like a wandering spirit, and even the rivers slept beneath a thick glass of ice. This was the world of the Vikings. Not the roaring warriors you may see carved into fiction, but people real and resilient, wrapped in fur and firelight, carrying generations of quiet survival in their bones. Welcome back. To echo, in the quiet hush of night outside your window, we will gently begin this exploration. Not with loud declarations, but with the soft unfolding of understanding, of how, through cleverness, tradition, and connection, the Vikings endured some of the harshest winters the world has ever known. And welcome to History for Sleep. The scent of ash, of peat smoke and old wood clings to everything. The Viking winter wasn't just something to get through. It was a season that shaped everything. But even in those moments, life pressed forward. Because beneath the silence of frost lay a current of perseverance, of systems passed down by word and deed, teaching the next generation how to layer wool, when to ration meat, how to seal the roof against drifting snow, the cadence of chores, the way food was prepared, the stories they told by firelight, and the dreams that crept in with the dark. We will explore the homes they built, the garments they wrapped around their children, the food they cherished, the fires they kept alive through the night. These long nights formed the crucible where their resilience was forged. Outside, the storm howls like a beast pacing the perimeter. But inside, there is a strange calm, the calm of ritual, of routine, of deeply knowing what must be done and when. There are few distractions, only the tasks of life, and the comfort of shared warmth. Tonight, we'll travel far north, not just across space, but deep into time, to the rugged, frost-laced lands of Scandinavia, in the heart of winter. This is a place where nights are long enough to make you forget the sun, where warmth is not a luxury, but a pursuit, a discipline, a craft. And somehow, the Vikings lived through it all, night after night, year after year, without modern heaters, without glass windows, without fleece-lined boots or insulated walls. When snow covered the long dirt paths and the sea froze into silence, life didn't pause. It changed tempo. The beating heart of the longhouse became the center of everything, the place where stories curled like smoke. Toward the rafters were mothers, mended wool with fingers cracked from cold, and fathers fed the fire as if it were a hungry god. They not only survived, they thrived. And as you settle deeper into the stillness of this moment, perhaps with a warm drink by your side, their world moved with the rhythm of nature, not the pulse of electricity. Here, every decision was a matter of survival. How high the roof was built, how tight the animal skins were laced around one's body, whether the salted fish from autumn would last until the thaw. Even the wind, yes, even the wind, carried stories and warnings and blessings, all at once. But let's take a step back and let the hush of snow settle in our minds. Imagine yourself walking barefoot upon the earthen floor of a Viking longhouse. It is in this simplicity that we begin to understand. And yes, there was hardship. The cold was not poetic. It was dangerous. Fingers numbed, livestock sickened, roofs groaned under snow. And so, as we begin this long and gentle voyage together, let your mind rest easy. There is no rush, only quiet curiosity. We will explore the homes they built, the garments they wrapped around their children, the food they cherished, the fires they kept alive through the night. We'll all step into the life of a young Viking boy as he comes of age in the stillness of a frozen land. We'll walk with him as he traverses icy fjords, celebrates the Yule feast, and returns changed. We'll drift through their stories of gods and giants, their whispers of the end times, and their strange dreams under cold stars. and we'll contrast the lives of chieftains and farmers, elite and enslaved, all bound by the same snowbound fate and the same communal will to endure. As you breathe slowly now, and perhaps feel the weight of your own blanket, know this: the past was not a fantasy. It was real, it was raw, and it was astonishing in its quiet brilliance. The story of how the Vikings did not freeze to death is not just a tale of survival. It is a story of warmth found in the coldest places. And once you do, once the snow-heavy world is behind you, there is a hush that falls. Not silence, exactly, but a change. Along the walls are raised platforms, lined with animal hides and straw mattresses, places to sleep, to rest, to talk softly as the wind hammers the world beyond. The fire runs long and low along the center, a glowing spine of orange and gold. There is no chimney. In wealthier homes, thick oak planks form a sturdy barrier, chinked with moss, wool, or dried mud to seal every tiny breath of wind. In poorer homes, turf is layered upon itself like cakes of earth, and timber frames brace the weight. Stone, when used, is more often for foundation than for shelter, as it draws the cold into itself. But wood breathes with you. Wood remembers warmth. And over time, the very bones of the house come to smell like stew and ash, and hands rubbed together near the hearth. Instead, the smoke filters slowly upward, seeping through slits in the roof or drifting back down to cling to hair and fabric, leaving its mark on every breath. But it is not unpleasant. It is presence. It is life. The air inside is thick with the scent of old wood, of smoke that curls lazily into the rafters, of woolen garments warmed by firelight. Your eyes take time to adjust to the dimness. No windows glare here. Light is earned from fire, from glowing embers, from oil lamps flickering in niches carved into the timber. It is alive, a living insulation of bodies and breath and habit. In winter, families cluster closer. Children nest together under layers of pelts. Elders wrap themselves in heavy cloaks and sit near the fire with still hands and closed eyes, listening to the rhythm of the flames. The fire, fed slowly with dried logs, must never die. Its light is a guardian. Its heat, a lifeline. Someone is always watching it, a quiet duty passed like a whisper from one person to the next. A story we will now begin. Together, imagine for a moment that you are no longer here, no longer surrounded by the quiet hum of your present world. Instead, you're standing on a windswept hill in the Northlands, where the sky hangs low with heavy gray clouds and the land stretches wide and cold and ancient. The wind pulls at your cloak. It bites and curls like something alive. And ahead of you, just beyond a line of weary trees and snow-silvered rocks, there is a low, unassuming structure. It is not tall, not grand, not decorated in gold or stone, but it is everything. It is warmth. It is family. It is survival. It is home. A Viking longhouse, the beating heart of a world built for endurance. To understand how the Vikings endured the bitterest winters, you must first understand how they lived inside these silent wooden giants. These longhouses that stood firm through seasons of wind, frost, and silence. At first glance, they seem almost too simple. A long rectangle of timber or turf, thick walls, and a steeply sloped roof, sometimes covered in sod, sometimes thatched with layers of straw, occasionally sealed with overlapping shingles that creaked and sighed under the weight of the snow. But like so many things built by necessity, their design is not only efficient, it is wise. Every choice, every angle, every beam speaks of generations learning how to coax warmth from a land that offers so little. The door is low, intentionally so. You must stoop to enter, allowing the precious heat to stay trapped inside. The longhouse stretches in both directions, a dark and welcoming tunnel. This is where winter is endured together. The walls themselves are built with intent. The insulation is not the kind you may know now. not laid in fiberglass or chemical foam. We'll step into the life of a young Viking boy as he comes of age in the stillness of a frozen land. We'll walk with him as he traverses icy fjords, celebrates the Yule feast, and returns changed. It was real, it was raw, and it was astonishing in its quiet brilliance. The story of how the Vikings did not freeze to death is not just a tale of survival. We'll drift through their stories of gods and giants, their whispers of the end times, and their strange dreams under cold stars. And we'll contrast the lives of chieftains and farmers, elite and enslaved, all bound by the same snowbound fate and the same communal will to endure. At first glance, they seem almost too simple. A long rectangle of timber or turf, thick walls, and a steeply sloped roof, sometimes covered in sod, sometimes thatched with layers of straw, occasionally sealed with overlapping shingles that creaked and sighed under the weight of the snow. And once the snow-heavy world is behind you, there is a hush that falls. Not silence, exactly, but a change. Along the walls are raised platforms, lined with animal hides and straw mattresses, places to sleep, to rest, to talk softly as the wind hammers the world beyond. The fire runs long and low along the center, a glowing spine of orange and gold. There is no chimney. Instead, the smoke filters slowly upward, seeping through slits in the roof or drifting back down to cling to hair and fabric, leaving its mark on every breath. But it is not unpleasant. It is presence. It is life. The air inside is thick with the scent of old wood, of smoke that curls lazily into the rafters, of woolen garments warmed by firelight. Your eyes take time to adjust to the dimness. No windows glare here. In wealthier homes, thick oak planks form a sturdy barrier, chinked with moss, wool, or dried mud to seal every tiny breath of wind. In poorer homes, turf is layered upon itself like cakes of earth, and timber frames brace the weight. Stone, when used, is more often for foundation than for shelter, as it draws the cold into itself. But wood breathes with you. Wood remembers warmth. And over time, the very bones of the house come to smell like stew and ash, and hands rub together near the hearth. Light is earned, from fire, from glowing embers, from oil lamps flickering in niches carved into the timber. But like so many things built by necessity, their design is not only efficient, it is wise. Every choice, every angle, every beam speaks of generations learning how to coax warmth from a land that offers so little. As you breathe slowly now, and perhaps feel the weight of your own blanket, know this: the past was not a fantasy. It is a story of warmth found in the coldest places. A story we will now begin. Together, imagine for a moment that you are no longer here, no longer surrounded by the quiet hum of your present world. Instead, you're standing on a windswept hill in the Northlands, where the sky hangs low with heavy gray clouds, and the land stretches wide and cold and ancient. The wind pulls at your cloak. It bites and curls like something alive. And ahead of you, just beyond a line of weary trees and snow-silvered rocks, there is a low, unassuming structure. It is not tall, not grand, not decorated in gold or stone, but it is everything. It is warmth. It is family. It is survival. It is home. A Viking longhouse, the beating heart of a world built for endurance. To understand how the Vikings endured the bitterest winters, you must first understand how they lived inside these silent wooden giants, these longhouses that stood firm through seasons of wind, frost, and silence. The door is low, intentionally so. You must stoop to enter, allowing the precious heat to stay trapped inside. The longhouse stretches in both directions, a dark and welcoming tunnel. This is where winter is endured, together. The walls themselves are built with intent. In wealthier homes, thick oak planks form a sturdy barrier, chinked with moss, wool, or dried mud to seal every tiny breath of wind. In poorer homes, Turf is layered upon itself like cakes of earth, and timber frames brace the weight. It is alive, a living insulation of bodies and breath and habit. In one section of the longhouse, usually toward the rear or in a lowered stall along the wall, cows and goats stood, their breath rising in white clouds their bodies, giving off a warmth that mingled with the human air. Days were measured not by the position of the sun, for it often did not appear, but by the tasks at hand, the weaving of wool, the carving of bone, the endless work of repairing, stitching, shaping. The architecture itself taught patience. The roof beams were joined without nails, fitted together with mortise and tenon, a technique that required precision and time. Every joint locked into place with the quiet confidence of someone who had built before, and who knew that the wind would come again. And it always did. Evenings were for stories, often spoken in the half-dark by the eldest among them, whose voices rasped like worn parchment, steady and slow. Children listened with wide eyes, while snow fell in silence outside, and the flames cast long shadows that danced across the curved beams above. Chickens clucked low in the corners. The earthy smell of dung and hay was ever present, but never revolting. A Viking longhouse could last for decades, even generations. Some were rebuilt on the same foundations again and again, layered with the presence of all who had lived there before. Buried beneath the floor, perhaps a small carved idol. Hidden behind a beam, a charm wrapped in wool. These things were not just houses. They were guardians, containers of spirit and tradition. They were the true defense against the cold. It was the smell of continuation, of milk and meat and morning. In winter, families cluster closer. Children nest together under layers of pelts. Elders wrap themselves in heavy cloaks and sit near the fire with still hands and closed eyes, listening to the rhythm of the flames. The fire, fed slowly with dried logs, must never die. Its light is a guardian. Its heat, a lifeline. Someone is always watching it, a quiet duty passed like a whisper from one person to the next. Stone, when used, is more often for foundation than for shelter, as it draws the cold into itself. But wood breathes with you. Wood remembers warmth. And over time, the very bones of the house come to smell like stew and ash and hands rubbed together near the hearth. The insulation is not the kind you may know now, not laid in fiberglass or chemical foam. The animals, too, often shared this space in winter. But there was more than warmth in these spaces. There was memory. Every board in the longhouse bore the trace of hands that had shaped it. Every pelt told a story of a hunt. Every tool on the wall, an iron hook, a woven basket, a wooden ladle, had been made with care. And in this togetherness, the harshness of the winter found its equal. The cold could batter the walls, but inside, a different climate ruled, one of murmurs and songs and the soft creak of shifting floorboards. You see, in the longhouse, time moved differently. And always, the house remembered. The Viking understanding of warmth was not simply about heat. It was about layers, of structure, of tradition, of relationship. But the longhouse stood. In some regions, the roof was buried under turf, planted with hardy grasses that turned white in winter, forming an insulating blanket over the household. Snow itself became a tool, not an enemy. Its weight pressed down, sealing cracks, muffling sound. No panic, no scramble. Just the rhythm of life adapted to the season. When the nights stretched endlessly and the world narrowed to the space between one wall and another, the longhouse became the entire universe. And so, the longhouse remains in our memory, low and wide, shadowed and warm, standing still against the snow, a shape against the white, a line of smoke on the wind, a cradle of heat in the frozen dark. Every fiber had a purpose, and the art of dressing for winter was not about fashion. It was about wisdom. It was a quiet skill passed from one generation to the next, not written down in books, but remembered in the fingers of those who spun the wool. In the measured rhythm of weaving, you rise from your place on the sleeping bench, the fire reduced to glowing embers, and the air still and cold. You reach first for the innermost layer, a simple tunic of soft wool, worn close to the skin. Wool did not complain. It did not stiffen or shrink. It simply held fast. They were not cut in haste or made to dazzle. Every stitch was placed with reason. Seams were thick, often felled flat to reduce wind entry. Necklines were modest. A slit, a tie, nothing left open to the cold. And the act of dressing was itself a ritual. Quiet, deliberate, layered like the rings of a tree. You dressed not to express yourself, but to disappear into the landscape and survive with it. Then a second, thicker tunic, perhaps dyed a soft blue from woad, or a muted brown from alder bark. You wrap your legs in woolen hose or in narrow strips that spiral upward, bound tight and tied. Clothing was not simply worn. It was remembered, passed down, mended again and again until the edges softened and the fabric took on the shape of the wearer. A father's cloak might become a son's, a mother's mittens handed to a daughter now grown. And in this passing, there was a kind of inheritance, not of gold or jewels, but of survival. Of the knowledge held in each patch, each reinforcement, each fold made to shield against wind that knew no mercy. No part of the body was left bare without need. To be careless with skin in the cold was to invite pain, and the Vikings were not careless. They knew that warmth was not a luxury. It was something you earned with foresight. Over this, perhaps a cloak, fastened at the shoulder with a brooch, woven thick and lined, if you are fortunate, with fur along the collar. And in the way, a mother taught her child to wrap the cloak more tightly as the north wind blew harder through the trees. Everything necessary was there: food, family, fire, and time. Outside, the world could be cruel. Their fleece was thick, oily, dense with lanolin, a natural water repellent that offered more than warmth. It was protection. The raw wool, once shorn, was washed, carded, and spun by hand, the fibers drawn out with patience and turned into thread on a spindle that twirled slowly like time itself. The sound of spinning was ever present in the winter home, soft and steady like the creak of the beams or the low sigh of a fire. Wool became everything: tunics, cloaks, leggings, undergarments. Not bright, not smooth, but strong and enduring. The wind is whispering through a line of fir trees, each branch heavy with a powdering of snow. And somewhere, far in the distance, a raven calls once and then is silent. The fur of fox, marten, reindeer, and sometimes bear, soft and dense, the kind that held heat close to the body. Vikings hunted and traded for these pelts, not simply for show, but for the deep utility they offered in the months when snow fell, without ceasing, and ice formed upon the inner edge of the roof beams. Fur-lined gloves, boots with fur tucked inward, cloaks trimmed with it, along the edge where the wind first tried to enter. All around is stillness, a stillness deep enough to hear the weight of the cold pressing upon the earth. The kind of cold that finds its way through cracks, that sinks into the joints of wood, that does not ask permission to enter, but simply arrives and stays. And yet, in this place where the frost bites and the breath becomes visible, life continues, wrapped, layered, folded tightly into wool and fur, woven into the very fabric of survival. But here, in the stillness between snow and ember, the Vikings learned what it meant to endure. And below it all, life went on, held together by the bones of the longhouse and the breath of those within. The Viking longhouse, too, was a kind of cocoon, not glamorous, not ornate, but alive in its own way. Alive with breath, with voice, with memory. And it is in that place we have just begun to settle. A home built not only from timber, but from the quiet resolve to make it through one more winter. There is something deeply comforting in the steadiness of these homes. And as you listen now, perhaps you feel the weight of your own shelter, the walls around you, the quiet presence of ceiling and floor, of warmth held inside. This was not an age of comfort, but an age of certainty. You built well, or you did not survive. Step back again into the frozen quiet. The Viking world was not one of abundance or excess. It was a world where every thread mattered. Wool. Always it begins with wool. The sheep of the north were not like those of warmer lands. Imagine waking in the pre-dawn gray of a Viking winter fur. It was never the first layer. Fur was the guardian, worn atop wool like a shield of warmth. But always, it was wool that did the work beneath, trapping air, holding warmth, even when wet. There is something deeply soothing in the logic of these garments. Children, too, were bundled with care, wrapped in miniature versions of adult clothing, their cloaks pinned high to avoid dragging in snow, their heads covered always. And over all of this, the fabric, the fur, the fastening of brooches and belts, there was the culture of endurance. Clothing was not simply worn. It was remembered, passed down, mended again and again until the edges softened and the fabric took on the shape of the wearer. A father's cloak might become a son's, a mother's mittens handed to a daughter now grown. And in this passing, there was a kind of inheritance, not of gold or jewels, but of survival, of the knowledge held in each patch, each reinforcement, each fold made to shield against wind that knew no mercy. This simple truth, understood without modern science, guided the way garments were made, how they were worn, how they were stored. Boots were packed with straw or fur, dried each night by the fire. Mittens, not gloves, kept fingers together, sharing warmth. Hats pulled low over the ears, often conical or rounded, were lined inside with fleece and tied beneath the chin if needed. The dyes, too, were of the land. Faded reds from madder root, pale yellows from birch leaves. And the clothing they wore was the language of that negotiation. Tools that allowed the Vikings not just to survive, but to move, to build, to sing, to live. A language made not of words, but of folds, of fastenings, of the way a hem curled around the ankle, or a hood shadowed the face. But warmth made visible, sewn and spun, woven and worn, in the endless rhythm of winter. Somewhere, a boy wrapped his feet in straw before lacing up fur-lined boots. It was a presence, a character, a quiet adversary that arrived with the darkening of the days and lingered long into the yearning light of spring. To live in such a world was to know intimately the rhythm of scarcity, not just in warmth or in sunlight, but in nourishment, where fish and meat hung like silent pendulums absorbing the scent and flavor of birch and alder, the soft curl of firewood smoke rising day and night. Cabbages buried in barrels, roots sealed in whey or sour beer, milk left to curdle into thick, tangy cheese. All of these became the quiet companions of winter. Not glamorous, perhaps, not bursting with the color of ripe fruit or the sweetness of honey, but sustaining, reliable, a taste of memory, of preparation made real. There, in low-roofed huts beside the sea or on the edge of the village, silver-bellied herring and thick slabs of salmon transformed into something durable, something that could endure time and cold. Meat, too, from pigs, sheep, and occasionally cattle, was salted, dried, smoked, and stored. Nothing was wasted. Even the bones, once the marrow was drawn and the last scraps scraped away, could be boiled for broth or carved into tools. And yet, through this very constraint, the people of the North developed a way of life built on foresight, on patience, on the careful art of preservation. Because in the winter, the question was never simply what shall we eat, but rather, what did we manage to save? Somewhere the wind howled, and a brooch was fastened with trembling fingers, and the cold was held at bay for one more day. Every fiber was part of the winter strategy, and the strategy was survival. The moment grain was threshed, fish were caught, meat was butchered, a clock began to tick in reverse. Everything not consumed immediately had to last, not for weeks, but for months, sometimes half a year or more. The winter had no patience for forgetfulness. A single spoiled sack of barley could mean hunger. A misjudged barrel of fish could spread sickness. And so they prepared, not in fear, but with reverent diligence. There were no mirrors in every room, no garments worn for a single season and cast aside. Clothing was a partnership between human and nature, between warmth and wind. It was worn with pride, not for its appearance, but for its service. And now shift your thoughts to the far end of the house where food was kept, not in pantries lined with tidy jars, but in cold corners and earthen pits in woven baskets and leather sacks in wooden barrels crusted with the salt of summer labor. And even the decorative elements that did exist, embroidery at the cuffs, tablet woven trim at the edges, were often made with the same materials, the same dyes, the same slow, careful effort, a way of marking time, a way of saying, I was here. I endured this season, and the season before. The colors of the Viking world in winter were not vivid but resonant, a palette of earth and fire, bark and stone. And among the wealthier families, imported silks or bright threads might appear, traded from far-off lands. But even then, they were sewn into practical forms. And constant, you might imagine what it meant to rise each morning into air so cold it made your teeth ache, and to dress not for style, but for protection. To wrap yourself in the work of your own hands, or the hands of those you loved. To step outside, layered not only in fabric, but in knowledge. In the ancient wisdom of wool and fur and fire. A particular shape or pattern might say something about your clan, your trade, your place in the woven web of the Viking world. And yet, even the poorest might wear a pin, plain, utilitarian, the kind made to last, not to impress. Because holding your cloak closed could mean the difference between illness and health, frostbite and warmth. Beauty, for the Viking mind, was found in function, in durability. In the way a garment moved with the body, held heat near the chest, defied the sting of sleet on the back of the neck. And always there were cloaks. The Viking cloak was more than warmth. It was protection from the world. Made of heavy wool, often worn diagonally, it allowed for one arm to remain free while the other stayed wrapped and close to the core. Cloaks billowed in wind, caught snow like sails, and when drawn around a sleeping child, formed a kind of tent against the dark. Some were lined with fur, others double-layered, and nearly all were held in place by a brooch or pin, often the only ornamentation on an otherwise simple form. These brooches told stories. Made of bronze or iron, sometimes inlaid with glass or bone, they marked status, skill, sometimes even origin. Beneath it all, the layers breathed. Wool, when thick and brushed, held pockets of air. And air is what insulates. And when garments grew thin, they were not discarded. They were patched, reused, taken apart, and remade into something smaller. Waste was not an option. The Viking attitude toward dress, particularly in winter, was never one of vanity. And so, as you listen, perhaps beneath your own blanket, with the heat of your room gentle, in those long Viking winters, the body was not separate from the cold. It negotiated with it. These were not costumes. They were tools. Tools that carried warmth across fields of snow, through long dark nights, across icy fjords. And so, the next time you draw on a sweater or pull a blanket to your chin, remember this. Somewhere once, a child in a longhouse reached for her woolen mittens as her mother held out a cloak. That is the quiet legacy of their clothing. Not fashion, not armor. In the world of the Vikings, the cold was not merely a season. Imagine now the longhouse once again, the quiet glow of the hearthlight, the layered clothing of those within, the silence beyond the door where the snow piles gently against the walls. For the Vikings, the harvest was not the feast, it was the beginning of the waiting. The smell of smoke so ever-present in Viking life was not just from the hearth, it was from the smokehouse fermentation, too, was a kind of alchemy. Cabbages buried in barrels, roots sealed in whey or sour beer, milk left to curdle into thick, tangy cheese. All of these became the quiet companions of winter. Not glamorous, perhaps, not bursting with the color of ripe fruit or the sweetness of honey, but sustaining. Dug into the ground or beneath the longhouse, these cool, dark spaces held turnips and carrots, onions and leeks, each one nestled in straw or sand to keep them from rot. Root vegetables were not only food, they were time made edible. The hours spent in harvest, in hauling, in storage, were folded into every bite. With it, they preserved, seasoned, and cured. Honey, rare but valued, was used sparingly, more often in ceremonies, or in mead than in meals. And when sweetness was needed, it came from apples dried into leathery slices, or from dried peas and beans cooked slowly into stews that thickened the air with their earthy scent. And as winter stretched onward, each remaining root was counted not just for calories, but for weeks of survival. They knew the exact curve of a carrot pulled too soon. They knew the sound of a barrel gone sour. They knew which herbs soothed the stomach, and which root might help with cough. And as you listen now, perhaps full from your own day, you might close your eyes and imagine the steam rising from a simple bowl in a Viking longhouse. The way it curls upward, the way hands wrap around the warmth, the way in silence a family eats together while winter presses in. They knew the patience it took to dry 100 fish, the weight of a full grain sack on the shoulder, the quiet satisfaction of seeing shelves lined with food as the first frost crept across the ground. Every meal was a link in the chain of survival, every bite the product of days and months of labor, of planning and gathering, of drying and storing. The rest sleep on, not in deep, uninterrupted slumber, but in layers of restfulness. Sleep came in phases, like tides. A gray glow that touched the smoke before it touched the floor. It was enough. Enough to begin the slow movement of limbs, the sound of feet on wood, the soft rustle of woolen clothing drawn close. The house stirred, but not abruptly. There was no rush. Time was not pressing. It was stretching. One might rise for a time, stoke the embers, murmur a few words to another half-awake soul, and then return to warmth. The house, in these hours, breathed like a living thing, quiet, patient, at peace with the dark. And this, too, was how they endured. In the depths of the Viking winter, when the sun lifted only briefly over the edge of the horizon, and even then, the wind might flatten itself against the door, with no desire to leave. But inside, life arranged itself in quiet harmony with the dark, not in fear nor idleness, but in rhythm. A rhythm not governed by clocks or bells, but by breath, by warmth, by the slow shift of flame and shadow. More a soft, pale ghost of itself than a source of warmth. Time itself began to bend. The rules of day and night, so firm in summer, grew gentle and blurred. Hours were no longer counted by the sun's path, but by what the body remembered, what the fire required, what the rhythm of tasks and stories whispered from one moment to the next. In that soft and steady obscurity, a different kind of day unfolded, not sharp, not swift, but flowing like meltwater beneath ice. Meals were communal, taken beside the fire, often from shared bowls. There was no excess, but there was always sharing. A child's bowl might have less, an elder's a little more. Those who hunted or wove or watched the fire through the darkest hours might find an extra piece of meat in their broth. And when there was a feast, Yule, perhaps, or the midwinter sacrifice, it was all the more meaningful. Not for the abundance, but for the rarity. reliable, the taste of memory, of preparation made real. It was hearty, dense, nourishing, broths rich with marrow, porridge thickened with lard or cheese. The choices they made, what to grow, what to store, what to trade, were deliberate. And even in the bleakest months, there was a rhythm. Morning might begin with warm milk or broth. Midday, a piece of flatbread or smoked fish. Evening, the main meal, eaten slowly in the company of others, under the flicker of flame and the soft hush of snow pressing against the walls. Fish tough but flavorful from smoke. Stews that simmered for hours, filling the longhouse with the scent of thyme, garlic, or dried lovage. The meals filled the belly and stilled the shiver. And when the body warmed, the spirit followed. And in the earth itself, beneath the frost, the Vikings had their cellars. Grain, precious and measured, was kept in sacks or bins, often suspended from the rafters or tucked high on platforms to keep the damp and the rats at bay. Barley, rye, and oats were milled by hand or chewed into mash for brewing. Not a drink for revelry, but one of sustenance. It held calories, warmth, and a kind of familiarity that cut through the cold. But there were berries dried in summer sun and stored in leather pouches, lingonberries, cloudberries, bilberries, tiny bursts of sweetness that held the memory of warmer days. A spoonful in winter was not just flavor. It was like remembered. In the evenings, as the fire glowed and the longhouse quieted, the sharing of ale was a small ritual, a reminder that even in scarcity, something could be made, could be shared, could endure. Bread, when it was made, was dense and flat, sometimes cooked on hot stones near the fire, sometimes carried into the snow wrapped in cloth. It was not a daily food, but a moment of comfort, a reassurance of labor turned into nourishment. And with grain came ale, thick, cloudy, slightly sour, sometimes sweetened with herbs or wild honey. There were no bananas, no oranges, no soft fruits flown in from distant lands. Salt, too, was treasured, scraped from coastal rocks, oiled from seawater, or traded with neighboring clans. Food in the Viking winter was never mindless. It was ceremony. Not in grandeur, but in awareness. And what of the taste? The Viking winter meal was not delicate. This was a cuisine without cookbooks, but not without thought. It is easy now, in a world of ready abundance, to forget the intimacy once shared with food. But the Vikings knew it well. And in this knowing, they found peace. Because food was not just fuel, it was continuity. It was what tethered them to the past and carried them through the dark toward the future. There is no rush here, no excess. Only the quiet hum of survival and the deep nourishment of food earned, prepared, and preserved. This was how they ate. The world begins not with light, but with shadow. The longhouse, always the anchor, became the world entire. Outside, snow might fall for days without pause. Imagine it. The fire has burned low through the night, tended once or twice by someone who stirred gently from their bed of hides. When the first hint of light came, it did not burst through the windows, for there were few windows to speak of, but filtered in through the roofline. A gray glow that touched the smoke before it touched the floor. It was enough. Enough to begin the slow movement of limbs, the sound of feet on wood, the soft rustle of woolen clothing drawn close. The house stirred, but not abruptly. There was no rush. Time was not pressing. It was stretching. Chores, when done, were simple and essential. Water brought in from frozen streams, sometimes chipped from ice and thawed beside the hearth. Animals checked and fed. Grain measured, stew stirred, wood split with steady hands. The tasks were not many, but they were enough. But in the day-to-day, it was repetition that held the world together. A repetition so complete, so familiar, that it became comfort. The boiling of broth, the mending of cloaks, the checking of food stores, the sweeping of the floor. Their games were smaller in scope, drawn in corners of the room, with carved wooden toys or the weaving of string. They played beneath benches, in the folds of cloaks, with their own breath forming misty shapes in the cold air. Their laughter was not loud, but close, a secret shared with the firelight, measured not by what was achieved, but by what was sustained. And when they tired, they curled near their elders, not sent to sleep by commands, but by the natural pull of the quiet, one that speaks not of conquering the winter, but of coexisting with it. The Vikings did not race against the dark. They entered it, sat beside it, built lives within it. And when spring finally returned, when the snow melted from the rooftops and the rivers cracked open with the sound of running water, they stepped into the light not as survivors of war, but as keepers of rhythm, as those who had simply continued faithfully from one breath to the next, again and again, like the rhythm of a slow drumbeat beneath the silence. Without the distraction of bright lights and loud voices, people listened. The horses, if not stabled, were blanketed in thick straw and fed sparingly. The whole village, the whole region, the whole world seemed to slow in unison. A collective drawing inward, a collective patience. They remembered. They learned to feel time not as hours, but as moments layered upon one another. And in this way, they found a steadiness that the outside world could not break. Because while the snow might pile high against the walls, and the sun might vanish for weeks at a time, the inner world, the firelit world of rhythm and voice and ritual, remained unshaken. Each one a link in the long chain that kept life moving gently forward through the frost-bound days. And when the light faded again, sometimes as early as mid-afternoon, the world folded back in. There was no protest, no demand for entertainment beyond the voices of those nearby, no light to chase away the dark, except that which was carefully tended, cherished. In this way, the Viking winter day resembled a kind of waking hibernation, not sleep, but a resting alertness, a readiness without urgency, a life lived not in the forward rush, but in the deep settling in. The lamps were lit, small pools of orange flame dancing on carved wooden stands. Shadows lengthened and deepened. The outside world faded until it became only sound, the creak of trees, the distant crack of ice, the sigh of wind through the thatch. And sinew, the soft hum of a single voice, the rhythm of hands clapping gently in time, songs of old battles, of good harvests, of longing. Songs not meant to impress, but to soothe, to remind, to endure. In these sounds, time passed not as minutes, but as memories. And with that fading came the heart of the Viking winter day, a time of togetherness. Because it was in these hours, these long evenings, that the true life of the house emerged. There was no theater, no news, no distant city to send word from. But there were stories. Always stories, told in low voices, often by elders whose eyes had grown clouded, but whose memories burned bright. The tales wound their way through the night like smoke rising from the fire. Sagas of gods and giants, of distant voyages, of kin long gone. History and myth braided together, indistinguishable, and all of it spoken in the cadence of snow and slowness. And music, too, found its place. Not orchestras or grand performances, but the quiet pluck of stringed instruments carved from bone. There were no grand events, no glittering festivals, save for the sacred days like Yule, which we will touch upon later. And within that rhythm, there was space for something rare in our modern world: stillness. There was no expectation to fill every hour with novelty. Children adapted without question. The darkness, far from being feared, became a kind of canvas, one on which the imagination could paint. Even the animals fell into this rhythm. Their breath slow, their movements reduced. The hens ceased laying. The cattle stood still and silent for hours. And so The Viking winter day was never lost. It was just quieter, longer in feeling, deeper in texture. There is a quiet wisdom in this kind of life, one that speaks not of conquering the winter, but of coexisting with it. The Vikings did not race against the dark. They entered it, sat beside it, built lives within it. And when spring finally returned, when the snow melted from the rooftops and the rivers cracked open with the sound of running water, they stepped into the light not as survivors of war, but as keepers of rhythm, as those who had simply continued faithfully from one breath to the next. It had blanketed the fields with a softness that belied its intent, burying the last of the barley stubble and muffling the footsteps of those who moved through the village. Until now, he had followed, carried, watched. Now he walked beside his father and uncle, not behind. The three of them left the warmth of the longhouse before dawn and did not return until the sun, what little there was of it, had dropped once more behind the dark ridges to the west. They carried no torches. Only memory lit the path through the trees, and the occasional glint of frost along the branches. The world smelled of pine and cold iron, and Thorold's breath came in clouds he could almost hide inside. One morning, before the others stirred, he stepped outside alone. She said nothing, but her hand lingered briefly on his shoulder as he passed. The men could not hunt. The women worked by firelight. Children slept longer. And Thorold, now caught between boy and man, sat near the fire with his younger sister curled beside him, her head on his lap, her breath warm against his leg. He watched the flames rise and fall, watched the light play across the beams above, and he felt, perhaps for the first time, that time was not a straight road, but a circle. That this winter, his first as a man, was not a departure, but a returning. That evening, she handed him a bundle, a new pair of mittens lined with fur, made from the scraps of her own cloak. A gesture not of indulgence, but of acknowledgement, of the shift that had occurred quietly between one snowfall and the next. The frost clung thick to the beams of the house, and his boots crunched lightly as he walked past the fence toward the tree line. He was not hunting, not gathering, just walking. The air held that strange softness that sometimes comes before a storm, and the sky was the color of steel. He paused beneath a tree and listened, truly listened. And what he heard was not silence, but life holding its breath. A stillness so complete, it was its own kind of sound. The world turned white and still, and the air grew tight with the silence of what was to come. Trapping hare, watching for fox, listening for the faintest shift in the snow that might betray the presence of life beneath it. Thorold's eyes strained to see what his father seemed to sense with his skin. His ears rang with cold and effort, but he did not complain. He would not. For in this silence, this world of breath and snow and shadow, he began to understand what it meant to become. Thorold rose early the next morning, as the men of the household did, but this time he was not told to return to sleep, a tying of a knot that would hold through the wind. He was not praised when he succeeded, nor scolded when he failed. The cold offered no applause. The woods offered no comfort. But within that absence, Thorold began to find something steady. A rhythm, like the pull of a bowstring, like the heartbeat in his throat when he waited for a snare to tighten. He began to move with care, to listen with his whole body, to feel the world shift beneath its coat of white. His father, Halfdan, gave no long speech, no words of honor or warning. He sat not with the children, but among the men now, his bowl passed to him without a glance. He ate more, spoke less. His muscles ached in new ways, his fingers cracked from the cold, his eyes slow to readjust to firelight. But he did not seek the softness of his old corner. He sat near the hearth, where the light flickered strongest, and listened, not for instruction now, but for meaning, for belonging. Only a nod and a thick cloak, and the unspoken truth that everything would be different now. And now, As you lie still beneath your own layers, with a world of heat and light just a switch away, you may feel a small echo of that old rhythm. The hush between waking and sleep. The warmth that is not heat alone, but presence. The settling of thoughts. The slow drift of breath. He was seated near the hearth, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the longhouse. The hushed movements of his mother stirring. A pot, the gentle scratching of his sister, weaving beside the wall, the rhythmic hiss of damp wood spitting softly in the fire. But something had changed. It was subtle, like the shift in the air before a snowfall. A quiet knowing. A new weight that did not press from outside, but bloomed within. He was 15 winters now, and in the reckoning of his people, no longer a child. The season ahead would not find him merely watching and listening. It would ask of him. It would mark him. This would be the first winter that he would face not with open palms, but with responsibility pressed into his hands like the cold hilt of a hunting knife. That rhythm, slow, strong, enduring, is what carried them through. And now, in your quiet room, it carries you too. The first time Thorold felt truly alone, he was not alone at all. The snow had arrived early that year, falling silently during the final days of the harvest moon. His feet were unsure at first, not in the snow, for he had walked in snow since he could stand, but in his purpose. The hunt was not a grand affair. They were not after elk or bear, not this time. It was the small, steady work of survival. The lessons came not in words, but in gesture. A hand raised to signal stillness, the movement of a blade across a carcass. At night, he returned to the longhouse, and the warmth struck him like a story half remembered. The weeks passed, and the snow deepened. When he returned, his mother looked at him for a moment longer than usual. Later, a storm did come. Not wind and rage, but relentless snow, falling for 2 days and 2 nights, burying paths, silencing the forest. The men could not hunt. The women worked by firelight. Children slept longer. And Thorold, now caught between boy and man, sat near the fire with his younger sister curled beside him, her head on his lap, her breath warm against his leg, that the fire remembered even when the people did not. He began to hum, low and steady, a song his uncle sang when carving wood. A tune with no words, only motion. His mother looked up briefly from her weaving, and something unspoken passed between them, like the smoke rising into the beams. He watched the flames rise and fall, watched the light play across the beams above. He could read the wind by the movement of the trees, who checked the traps, who brought in the kindling. Snow, thick and wet at first, had turned brittle and fine, like ground bones scattered across the earth. The fjords, deep and winding, no longer mirrored the sky. Their waters had grown sluggish, edged with ice that cracked like thin glass beneath the weight of wind. Muscles tightened with cold, and the breath caught in the throat like a forgotten word. The oars dipped in and out of the black water, each stroke drawing them deeper into the corridor of stone and ice. Along the cliffs, thin waterfalls had frozen in mid-flight, suspended ribbons of glass clinging to rock. Thorold whispered the name under his breath, as his father did before him. Not a prayer, not a plea, only a remembering that the fjord had always been crossed, that risk and reward, need and endurance, had always moved hand in hand across these waters. Pines bent beneath snow, their outlines blurred as if sketched by an uncertain hand. And into this silence, beneath clouds so low they seemed to press against the mountains themselves, a journey began, not of glory, not of conquest, but of necessity. Only the creak of the boat, the whisper of water meeting wood, a sound of breathing, steady, measured. Behind them, the village was gone. Ahead, the next inlet waited. The purpose of the journey, trade, supplies, perhaps word from distant cousins, was a quiet star they followed, not burning, but glowing gently through layers of gray. Thorold had made shorter voyages before, But this was his first winter crossing. His father had said little, but he'd noticed the way the man had lingered by the prow, testing the edge of the ice with the handle of his spear. It was not fear, not hesitation. It was reverence. The fjord in winter was a creature not to be awakened, only crossed with humility. Who sat nearest the fire as the first story of the season was told, his eyes steady, his hands still marked with the memory of his first, long, cold becoming, softened the world until it became less a place of geography and more one of memory. Thorold blinked into it, let it settle on his lashes. It did not sting. It simply reminded him that he was part of the story now, the long, quiet history of crossings made not with certainty, but with faith in the old knowledge. His father had spoken the night before, words few and simple. Supplies were needed. A trade to complete. Their kin across the water waited. The route was known, but the season changed everything. In summer, the fjords carried them gently, their boats gliding over water clear as polished obsidian, the sun slipping behind peaks in golden reverence. But now, in winter's heart, the same path held silence like a blade. Beautiful, yes, but unyielding. But the boy who had once stood in awe of the fire now knew how to feed it, knew that warmth was made, not given, that every ember was a decision, that every scar, every knot tied, every story listened to in the dark was part of the thread that made him. The wood was dry, treated, wrapped in care and tar and prayer. They pushed off near dawn, though the sky gave little difference between day and night. A dull silver light hovered around them like a thought that would not take shape. Thorold's hands gripped the oar, not with panic, but with the slow, rehearsed trust of repetition. The fjord opened ahead, dark water flecked with floating shards, the shoreline fading quickly into white. He knew how to ration meat without being told. But more than these, he had learned something deeper, something that could not be named, only carried. The knowledge that winter was not an enemy to be fought, but a presence to be honored. That manhood did not come with ceremony, but with the silent patience of cold mornings and careful hands. And he felt, perhaps for the first time, that time was not a straight road, but a circle. That this winter, his first as a man, was not a departure, but a returning. Returning to the rhythm that his father had known, that his grandfather had passed down in gesture and silence. By the end of that winter, Thorold no longer walked like a boy. His steps were firm, measured, quiet. He could skin the hair in the dark. He would still stumble, still wonder, still feel the sting of wind on raw skin. And in this quiet knowing, Thorold entered not only a season, but a lineage. The longhouse, the snow, the forest, the fire, they had all watched, had all borne witness to his becoming. And though no words were said, and no marks carved, something had shifted deeply and forever. A place had opened for him beside the door, beside the tools, beside the old bench where his grandfather's axe still hung. A place earned not through conquest, but through enduring. And the next winter, when the first frost whispered against the window slats, and the sky began to pale with breathless snow, it was Thorold who rose before the others. The cold had settled in the bones of the land, not as an intruder, but as a rightful occupant reclaiming its season. Thorold rose before the rest, his cloak already on, the weight of the satchel across his back, felt not in pain, but in expectation. The boat was narrow, its ribs exposed like a fish cleaned and ready. Rowing in winter was not like rowing in the warmth of summer. The body moved slower, heavier. The air fought back. There was no talking. A light snow began to fall mid-journey. Not hard, not swirling, only persistent. It dusted their cloaks, rested in the folds of their hoods. They passed a headland marked with stones, the burial mound of a man long gone, whose name still lingered in song, but whose bones had long since merged with the earth. Thorold whispered the name under his breath, as his father did before him. Not a prayer, not a plea, only a remembering that the fjord had always been crossed, that risk and reward, need and endurance, had always moved hand in hand across these waters. But the deep-set ache that worked its way inward, layering itself between skin and spirit. They turned into a smaller inlet, one lined with low structures half buried in snow. Smoke rose thinly from one chimney. There was talk, low and spare, about goods and news, about kin and needs. The fire cracked once. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating the boat they would return in come morning. The fjords were not enemies. They were teachers. And the lesson always was patience, respect, endurance. But now Thorold had touched that stillness, had felt the depth of the winter fjord, not as a boy seeing it for the first time, but as someone who had entered it and emerged unchanged only in name, not in understanding. But for now, there was only warmth. There was only stillness. And in that stillness, Thorold understood something new. Thorold listened, but his body had begun to rest in small stages, muscles uncoiling without his consent, thoughts slowing into the gentle fog that followed effort. In these nights, the people came not to fight the cold, but to meet it head-on with something older than frost. Togetherness. His cheeks still held the sting of wind, but the warmth hit him immediately, not in a burst, but in waves, like stepping into firelight that remembers your name. Women moved with calm purpose, placing bowls, brushing stray snow from benches, adjusting furs draped on walls. Elders sat already, settled in places they'd known for decades, their eyes half-lidded with the comfort of seeing what they had seen before. The long gathering, the glow, the faces grown older, but still here. Inside, the hall pulsed with life. It was not loud, but full of movement, of the smell of meat and mead, of wet wool steaming gently, of pine resin burning slow and fragrant in long iron braziers. And the great hall, with its wide doors and deeper hearth, was the cradle of that togetherness. Here, clans met not for war or bargain, but to breathe in unison, to remember what it meant to be human in a world ruled by winter. A barked dog's voice reached them across the water, but came down thick and determined, blanketing the world with a silence that smothered even thought. The fjord behind them had darkened, swallowed by ice and memory, and ahead, smoke rose from the ridge in slow, spiraling columns that hinted at something waiting. But it was rich in a deeper way, in the kind that took all year to earn. Roasted meat, slow-cooked for days. Barley cakes wrapped in linen. Ale brewed strong and dark, passed in wooden mugs worn smooth by generations of hands. Fish cured in smoke, glistening in the light. And at the center, the Yule boar, not just a meal, but a symbol, laid out with quiet reverence, its presence acknowledged with murmurs, before the first slice was taken. Not danger, not hardship, but gathering. The kind that wrapped itself around you like an old cloak, familiar even if not worn in some time. Thorold's arms burned with fatigue. His fingertips, though gloved, tingled and throbbed. But for this one night, he would rest in the quiet rhythm of having crossed and having returned. But the sight ahead, the sign of arrival, brought no cheer or shout, but warm within, alive with breath and song and the hush of feet on warm wood. Its walls were lined with heavy timbers blackened by years of smoke, and its roof, patched and mended more times than memory could trace, bore the weight of countless winters. But this night, this season, was not about cold. It was about return. Only stillness. Relief, perhaps, worn so thin it resembled silence. Thorold did not fight it. He pulled his cloak tighter, shifted his scarf higher, breathed through his nose. The rhythm returned. Pull, breathe, release, pull again. The fjord narrowed. The mountains leaned closer. Ice clinked against the hull, but the boat held. They held. They ate little. A hard crust of bread shared between rows. A dried strip of meat chewed slowly while the boat drifted, letting the tide do its share of the work. The food was not for enjoyment, but for continuation. Even chewing felt like an act of discipline, a reminder that each movement had cost. They stopped once, drawn into a narrow cove ringed with ice. The silence there was so complete, it pressed against the chest. Thorold stepped ashore only briefly, to stretch, to relieve himself, to let his eyes wander up the sheer rock face that rose before them like the wall of the world. Somewhere, high above, a bird called once. Or perhaps it was the wind catching in a crevice. Back in the boat, the cold deepened. It was not the sharp bite of morning frost. Late that afternoon, though the sun never properly rose, the light began to shift again, sliding down the mountainside like a sigh. They were welcomed with nods, with hands clasped briefly, with a place by the fire and bowls of warm broth that steamed in the candlelight. That night, he lay wrapped in a borrowed blanket beside the hearth in the home of cousins he barely knew. Journeys in winter were not marked by distance alone. They were measured in silence endured, in breath held steady, in cold that did not defeat but refined. The next day they would cross again, homeward this time, the boat heavier with supplies, the path no easier. And so, as the flames cast their slow-moving shadows across the beams above him, he let his eyes close. The water would wait. The snow would keep falling. The snow had changed by the time they returned. It no longer drifted from the sky in soft veils. The great hall stood above the valley like a sleeping animal, long, broad, humped with snow. Yule was not marked by one day, but by a stretch of nights that felt folded over themselves, dark within dark, like velvet laid upon shadow. Thorold stepped through the doors with his father just behind him. Children clustered in corners, whispering behind cloaks. Men stood near the central fire pit, their shadows thrown high on the smoke-streaked beams. The food was not lavish in the way distant kings might boast of. No gold platters or jeweled goblets. But it was rich in a deeper way, in the kind that took all year to earn. Roasted meat, slow-cooked for days. Barley cakes wrapped in linen. Ale brewed strong and dark, passed in wooden mugs worn smooth by generations of hands. Fish cured in smoke, glistening in the light. And at the center, the Yule boar, not just a meal, but a symbol laid out with quiet reverence, its presence acknowledged with murmurs before the first slice was taken. An elder stood, not the oldest in years, but the oldest in memory. Her hair was white, but her eyes still caught the light like stone dipped in ice water. A younger man recalled a journey past the northern stones, where the sea steamed with breath and the sun never rose. One that pulled together the strands of family, of clan, of memory. The firelight turned skin to gold, and the rising smoke carried not just the scent of pine, but the shape of memory. Thorold sat beside his father, no longer new to the rhythm, but still learning how it fit inside him. Not to sleep, but to rest. To trust. The journey, the snow, the cold. All of it now lay behind the thick doors of the hall. And inside, there was only the breath of those around him. The slow dying down of the fire, the quiet hum of a song he had not yet learned the words to, but knew, somehow, he always had. He did not speak that night, but he listened. Closely, not just with ears, but with something deeper. He watched the way people nodded in time with a story before the ending came. He noticed which names were spoken with reverence, which with laughter, which with a hush. And he began to understand that Yule was not just a feast, each story a thread, each song a knot, each shared glance a stitch that bound the past to the present without demand. It was not ceremony. It was not even tradition, in the stiff sense. It was necessity. Because when the snow lasted this long, and the stars blinked coldly from behind clouds that never cleared, it was not enough to have food or fire. You needed stories. You needed to hear yourself echoed in someone else's memory. You needed to know that others had been cold, had been afraid, had laughed, had survived. A woman recounted the last Yule of her mother, when she spoke her final blessing with a hand still wrapped in wool she had woven herself. Laughter came now and then, gentle and knowing. No jest was cruel, no boast too sharp. This was not the time for display. It was the time for weaving. Her voice did not rise with drama, but sank into the room like a familiar smell. She spoke not to impress, but to recall, to give shape to things that had no bones. But food was only part of it. The feast was an anchor, but not the fire. Of the boy who fell through, and was saved by a fox that returned each night for a piece of bread. Of the fire that would not catch until the first snow melted in the elder's hand. She spoke slowly, sometimes pausing not to remember, but to let the silence carry its part of the tale. And the room listened, not leaning forward, not holding breath, but resting in the story like in warm water. The fire came from voice, from the songs that rose as bellies filled and silence fell in comfortable pockets. A low hum at first, then a clearer note. One voice, then two, then more. Songs not written, but remembered. Not polished, but carried. Some were chants, deep and slow, repeating like the turn of seasons. Others told of gods and giants, of ships and storms, of wolves that chased the moon, and trees that remembered the first breath of wind. Thorold sat among them, his hands clasped loosely, the taste of mead still on his tongue, and felt the songs settle into him, not as performance, but as inheritance. And then came the stories. The fire was stirred, the lamps adjusted, the crowd quieted without command. She told of the long winter when the fjord froze thick enough to walk across in a day and back again by night. When she finished, there was no applause. Only a shift, the kind that happens when something inside you has changed shape without needing to be named. Others stood, because that's what the Great Hall became during Yule, a loom. And as the hours passed, the hall grew warmer, not just with heat, but with presence. It was the act of remembering how to belong. And in that act, something inside him began to settle. Not to sleep, but to rest, to trust. The journey, the snow, the cold, all of it now lay behind the thick doors of the hall. And inside, there was only the breath of those around him, the slow dying down of the fire, the quiet hum of a song he had not yet learned the words to, but knew, somehow, he always had. When the time came to leave the great hall, no bell rang, no voice called out. He stood for a while, near the door, his hands still raw from travel, the snow melting in patches across his cloak. But something older, the part of him that had carried the season like a burden, and now laid it down, not with relief, but with reverence. The longhouse settled into its familiar routines, but Thorold moved through them differently now. He walked the perimeter of the land in the soft gray of afternoon, listening to the branches creak under their frozen burden, watching the slow movement of clouds across a pale sky. Deeper, not because the room had changed, but because he had. Sleep came not as a surrender, but as a continuation. His dreams were not vivid or wild. They were quiet, slow, shaped like the fjords, like the sound of wind moving through trees that have forgotten the sun. In those dreams, he was not the hero of a saga. He was simply present, walking, watching, enduring. He visited the trap lines without being asked. Not for pride, not for praise. Simply because it needed to be done. He sat up, not startled, just aware. There was nothing to see, no task to complete. Just the quiet, just the presence of being in it. Within the season, not apart from it. He knelt then, slowly, and pressed one bare hand to the snow. It did not burn. It simply was. Cold, yes, but not cruel. The fire had died almost completely, leaving only the barest ember glow. He stood, pulled on his cloak, and stepped outside. The world was blue, that strange deep blue that lives only in the hours before light, when everything seems made of shadow and memory. The sky above held stars in patterns he could nearly name, though the names escaped him now. The air was so still it hummed. And because he understood now that no one season stood alone, winter was not separate from summer. Preparation began long before the snow. Survival did not happen in a moment. It happened through the accumulation of many small acts done faithfully over time. His hands found tasks without being told. His feet walked familiar paths, but landed with more certainty. His younger sister watched him with the subtle curiosity only a child can carry, the way one watches a tree that has suddenly grown taller overnight. His grandfather, silent most days, handed him a worn blade one morning without comment. Not new, not ceremonial, just useful. The blade fit his hand easily, because he understood, in a way he had not before, that winter was not something you endured to reach spring. It was not an obstacle. It was a shaping. His mother stirred from her place beside the fire, met his gaze, and gave a small nod, a gesture not of surprise, nor welcome, but of recognition. She had known they would return, just as she had known they would go. Thorold nodded back, then removed his outer cloak, shook off the snow in silence, and hung it beside the others. His movements were automatic now, shaped by repetition, but behind every gesture was a new weight, not of exhaustion, but of meaning. People rose not together, but gradually. No one spoke as they reached it. No words were needed. The door was opened, not knocked. The warmth inside was steady, not celebratory, not waiting with ceremony, just there, like it always had been. The others were already resting, their shapes outlined under furs, their breathing part of the quiet rhythm of the space. The fire had burned low, coals pulsing like the last heartbeat of a song. Thorold stepped across the threshold and let the warmth move over him like a returning wave. Some left with torches, others without, stepping out into the deep quiet of the snow-covered night as if re-entering a dream that had merely paused. The sound of doors closing behind them was muffled, not final. Yule had not ended, not exactly. It had simply been tucked away again into the folds of memory, where stories rest like coals, waiting to be stirred once more. Thorold walked the path home with his father and uncle, the three of them following footprints that were already softening beneath new snow. The air had turned colder again, the kind of cold that sharpens everything, that makes you feel your breath down to your ribs. But it did not bite now. It felt known, familiar. The kind of cold that walks beside you like a companion who says nothing but remains present. The kind of cold you no longer resent. The longhouse rose out of the white slowly, its roofline half buried, its doorway faintly glowing from the flicker of firelight within. He did not sit, not yet. When he finally settled into his place, closer now to the fire than he had once been allowed, he rested not just his body. The days that followed were quieter. The storm passed, and in its wake, the world seemed suspended in a deeper stillness. Not lifeless, but listening. He spent more time outside now. Not for escape, but for presence. At night, he lay in the same spot he had always claimed, near the wall, close to the fire, beside his family. But his rest felt different. One morning, long before dawn, he woke to the sound of snow falling from the roof. A heavy thud followed by silence. He walked a short way into the snow, listening to the soft crunch beneath his feet, and then stopped. There was nothing to see, no task to complete. Just the quiet, just the presence of being in it. Within the season, not apart from it. He knelt then, slowly, and pressed one bare hand to the snow. It did not burn. It simply was. Cold, yes, but not cruel. And in that moment, Thorold understood something that would stay with him the rest of his life. Something not taught, not said, not even fully formed in thought. He understood that he had crossed a threshold not marked by ceremony or title, but by the still, enduring fact of having lived through the winter as a participant. Not someone who was carried through it, but someone who carried a part of it with him now, always. And that was enough. That was everything. From the nothingness, from the vast and gaping Ginnungagap, the great void before creation, there emerged the clash of elemental realms. His flesh became the land, his blood the seas, his bones the mountains. And yet, even after his death, the frost never left. His kin remained, driven to the far edges of the world, to Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. There they dwelled, in crags and caves and distant peaks, watching the 9 worlds from afar. Not gone, never gone, only waiting. To the north, Niflheim, land of ice, shadowed and still, its rivers frozen with venom. And his children, the serpent Jormungandr, so vast he encircled the world. The wolf Fenrir, whose jaws would tear the very sky. They would not survive. That was never in question. The Tailies did not offer escape. They offered meaning. That to stand against the cold, even knowing you will fall, is still worth doing. That to light a fire in the dark, even knowing the dark will come again, is still a sacred act. They were the howling wind that kept him awake at night, the cracking ice on the shoreline, the way hunger thinned even the kindest voices. Fimbulwinter was not far off in some prophetic future. It was a memory every winter carried in its core, a reminder of what could come, a warning not in fear, but in readiness. And Hel, the silent queen of the dead, rising from her shadowed halls to claim what remained. To the south, Muspelheim, land of fire, flickering with heat and motion. And between them, where their breath met and mingled, Ymir came into being, not born, but formed. Within the ashes of Ragnarok, there was always a whisper, not of victory, but of renewal, that some would survive. Not gods, not kings, but a man and a woman, hidden deep within the branches of the world tree, Yggdrasil. That the earth, though scorched and broken, would rise again. Green would return. The sun would be reborn, brighter than before. And the world would begin once more, not the same, not healed, but alive. A giant, vast and formless, and from his body came the frost giants, those ancient forces that carried the cold, not as affliction, but as essence. They were the maps etched in the heart that taught the listener how to be in the face of forces beyond control. Thorold had heard them as a child, in pieces, names, shapes, monsters. But now, as he sat in the silence of his own breath, having walked the fjords, shared in the Yule fire, and returned with the cold still clinging to his boots, the stories unfolded differently. When he returned to the longhouse, the others still slept. The fire had begun to stir again. He added wood carefully, not waking anyone, and watched the first flames curl upward with quiet grace. The great winter. The one not born of season, but of destiny. Fimbulwinter was not a snowstorm. It was not even a series of blizzards. It was the unraveling. A winter that would last 3 years, without a single summer to divide its fury. It was not simply dread. It was reverence. It was inevitability. The twilight of the gods. The breaking of the bonds that held the world in its uneasy balance. The sun devoured by the wolf skull. The moon swallowed by his brother Hati. Stars falling from the sky like sparks from a dying fire. And then the ground would shatter. Mountains would crumble. The seas would rise. And from the ice, the frost giants would march again. Snow upon snow, ice upon ice, hunger layered atop fear. Crops would fail. Livestock would fall silent. Even kin would turn against each other, not out of wickedness, but out of desperation. And after this long silence of light, the end would begin. Then he lay down once more, his breath steady, his body warm, and allowed himself to drift, not back into dreams, but into that space between thought and sleep, where memory folds itself into the skin. And somewhere outside, the snow kept falling, slow and soundless, shaping the world again, just as it had shaped him. The wind carries stories. Even when it howls through empty branches or whistles between the slats of old timber, it is never silent. The Norse knew this, knew that behind every gust was a whisper, behind every silence, a presence. In the long nights of winter, when frost painted the inside of the walls, and even the moon seemed distant and watchful, the people of the north listened closely, not just to the voices of their kin, but to the breath of the world itself. And in that breath, they felt something older than memory, a force that stirred beneath the snow behind the stars, deep within the dark, a force that had no mercy and no need for warmth. The Jitner, the frost giants, the ancient cold that waited not with hunger, but with certainty. To live through a Norse winter was to understand in your bones that the cold was not merely weather. It was something closer to a truth, an elemental will that could not be reasoned with. It was not angry, not cruel. It simply was. And from that understanding came the stories, the myths, the warnings passed in firelight from elder to child, wrapped in symbols older than carved stone. There was a reason the gods themselves had enemies, a reason that even Odin, the Allfather, could not banish the frost. It was not meant to be banished, only watched, endured, and remembered. Ymir was the first. That is how the stories begin, not with light, not with glory, but with cold. The gods who came after, Odin and his brothers, would shape the world from Ymir's body. And what they waited for, what every heart feared beneath the safety of wool and firelight, was the coming of Fimbulwinter Ragnarok. To say the Norse feared Ragnarok would be to miss the shape of the story entirely. Led by their own, by Loki, the trickster god once blood brother to Odin, now turned to fire and chaos. Even the gods, even Thor with his hammer, even Odin upon Sleipnir, knew their fates. And yet, so these stories, told not in times of joy, but in nights of deep cold, were not despair. They were preparation. They were inheritance. He saw not literal beasts, but the truths beneath them. The frost giants were not merely myth. They were the howling wind that kept him awake at night, the cracking ice on the shoreline, the way hunger thinned even the kindest voices. Fimbulwinter was not far off in some prophetic future. It was a memory every winter carried in its core, a reminder of what could come, a warning not in fear, but in readiness, that all things, no matter how powerful, how wise, how ancient, must one day yield, and that in that yielding, something else might rise, something humbler, something quieter, a new sun, a new world, a new breath. And Ragnarok, that final desperate clash of flame and frost, it was not only a doom, but a mirror. It reminded him that even the gods did not last forever. The firelight flickered as he thought of these things, the flames casting long shadows that danced like old giants along the walls of the longhouse. Outside, snow fell again, gentle this time, that every season might be the last, and yet you rise. Not a single day, but a threshold, a turning point, the moment when darkness reached its deepest well, and then, almost imperceptibly, began to rise. In the Norse mind, Yule was not the end of winter, far from it. The cold would last for many weeks more. But Yule marked something deeper, the rebirth of light, a sacred hinge between decay and renewal, between silence and song, only to hover near the edge of the sky like a distant thought, pale and cold before, slipping again below the horizon without promise. The Norse were not wasteful. A gift was not given lightly. But in those darkest days, when the world hovered at the edge of stillness, they gave anyway. They gave not to gods as distant figures demanding appeasement, but to forces that lived within the cycle itself. Odin was honored, yes, the Allfather, the wanderer of 9 worlds. Freyr too, the god of fertility and growth. And Thor, the protector, whose hammer was believed to guard even against the creeping death of winter. But more than the gods, the people gave to the rhythm itself, to the sun, to the soil, to the unseen breath of what kept the world moving. They knew it from the long, careful watching of shadows, from the feel of the air, the breath of the earth, from the instinct passed down from those who survived by noticing. It was immense. A chosen piece of wood, often carved or blessed, sometimes passed from generation to generation. It was laid upon the hearth with reverence, and it was meant to burn for days, a steady flame that outlasted the longest night. Some families would light the log with the last ember of the previous year's Yule fire, carrying forward the flame as a living thread, unbroken by time. They understood that the sun, though vanished, was never truly gone. It waited somewhere below the curve of the world, beyond the reach of thought, and each year, at the same time, it returned. Slightly, slowly, but faithfully. And that return had to be met, had to be honored. The darkness during those days is not hostile, but it is complete. A darkness that wraps itself around the land, not with violence, but with gravity, for invocation. In the center of villages, on sacred ground, in the great halls and hidden groves, they built flames that reached into the night like prayers made of heat. The fire was not a celebration of what had been, but a calling forth of what would be. A guiding light for the sun itself. A mirror held up to the sky. You are welcome here. Return to us. It quiets the birds, stills the rivers, slows even the heart. But it never fully wins. Because within that silence, that long stretch of night that seems to have no end, there is always a small waiting glow. A promise, a flicker, a fire. You tend the fire. You tell the story. You pass it on. Not to preserve the past, but to prepare the future. The wind rested. The stars, though faint, blinked through a break in the clouds. And he felt not fear, not even awe, but understanding. That to live in the north was to live in the company of endings. So when the frost giants returned in tale and in weather, he would know what to do, not fight them, but stand with the warmth still glowing in his chest. There are moments in the depth of winter when the sun seems to forget the world entirely, rising late. Yule begins in that flicker, long before it became a word carved into the memory of later cultures. Long before it was softened into song and celebration, Yule was a sacred space and time. The ancients knew this turning long before they could name the solstice, so they lit fires, not just for warmth, but for symbol. The Yule log, now remembered in scattered tradition and story, was not a small thing. And around that fire, rituals unfolded. Offerings were made, of food, of drink, of crafted tokens, sometimes even of livestock, not from abundance, but from intention. The Norse were not wasteful. A gift was not given lightly. But in those darkest days, when the world hovered at the edge of stillness, they gave anyway. The evergreen, unchanged by snow or frost, stood as a quiet witness to resilience. Not flourishing, but enduring. And in that, it became sacred. They gave not to gods as distant figures demanding appeasement, but to forces that lived within the cycle itself. It was something he stepped into. The fire popped once, sending a small stream of sparks upward, and he watched them rise. For a brief second, they glowed as brightly as stars, then vanished, not with drama, but with purpose. It was a covenant with it, like breath released after a long-held thought. He helped gather the wood, helped clean the tools, helped prepare the offering of food that would be placed upon the family stone outside the longhouse. A token to the gods, yes, but also to the land itself. But in a slow, subtle loosening of what is held firm during brighter days. Instead, they turned inward. And in that turning, they began to listen to the language beneath language, to dreams that drifted in slowly like smoke, and to the shapes carved carefully into bone, into stone, into wood, the runes. A reminder that the world was not random, even when it felt vast and indifferent. That somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the ice and the silence and the long shadows, there was order. Not one we could command, but one we could read, if we were still enough. In the endless hush of snow-covered nights, when the wind outside grows less like weather, not all were welcome. Some dreams unsettled. Others arrived with an air of comfort, wrapping the sleeper in memories so vivid they carried the scent of last summer's grass or the sound of a voice long gone. The Norse did not separate dreams from life with clean lines. A dream was not merely the mind's play. It was a visitation, sometimes from gods, sometimes from the dead, sometimes from the self, revealed in a form not easily recognized. They were carved, one deliberate stroke at a time, into something solid, something that would endure. Each rune was a symbol, yes, but also a whisper, a gesture, a frozen moment of intention. They were often cut into pieces of yew or ash, sometimes bone, and kept in pouches by those who listened closely to the old ways. When cast onto a cloth or the packed snow, the runes did not speak loudly. They offered glimpses, angles, a shift in direction, a thread of guidance in a season that offered few visible paths. And more like a presence circling the house, the edges between the waking world and the world of dreams begin to blur. And it was in this soft, in-between space that the Old Norse found meaning. Not through proof or certainty, but through symbols, through stories that moved like shadows just beyond the reach of firelight, through signs left behind by things they could not always name, but always felt. His mother had taught him the song that accompanied the lighting of the hearth. His father had shown him how to carve the runes into the candle holder they would use. His sister had plaited evergreen branches and tied them with wool threads to hang near the door. Odin was honored, yes, the Allfather, the wanderer of 9 worlds. Freyr, too, the god of fertility and growth. And Thor, the protector, whose hammer was believed to guard even against the creeping death of winter. Only the steady crackle of flame and the warmth that crept across the floorboards toward him. And in that warmth, he felt the pulse of something old. Not a god, perhaps, not a spirit, but a knowing. That life, though fragile, was also patient. That light, though flickering, was also faithful. And that in this moment, with fire burning, family near, stories echoing from one end of the hall to the other, he was exactly where he was meant to be. But more than the gods, the people gave to the rhythm itself, to the sun, to the soil, to the unseen breath of what kept the world moving. In some places, evergreens were brought indoors, not decorated with ornament, but placed as reminders that even in the coldest silence, something remained alive. The night of Yule was long, and so it was filled with things to carry one through. There was food, yes, rich and fatty, meant to sustain. There was drink, strong and warm. But most of all, there was story. The kind that did not distract, but connect. Tales of past Yules, of ancestors who once gathered under the same beams. Stories of old kings, of spirits in the wood, of omens seen in the flames. The line between this world and others thinned. Dreams became vivid. The dead were remembered, not mourned, but welcomed. Their names spoken aloud, their lives recounted beside the fire as if they, too, had simply stepped outside for a moment and would return again before the embers cooled. Children sat close, eyes wide, not afraid but listening. The fire cast dancing shapes upon their faces, and they watched not just the stories, but the tellers, learning the weight of certain words. The pause before a name, the tilt of the voice when speaking of a year when the snow came early and stayed too long. In this way, Yule was not merely observed, it was absorbed. It entered the memory, like the scent of smoke and wool. Subtle, permanent. For Thorold, now in the fullness of his first winter as a man, Yule was no longer an event that happened around him. And when the Yule fire was finally lit, he sat beside it in silence, his hand resting on his knee, his thoughts as slow and quiet as the drifting snow outside. There were no grand visions, no visitations. Yule was not a cure for winter. A promise whispered into firelight. We will not forget how to hope. There is something about deep winter that begins to shift the borders of reality, not by force, not all at once. When the sun did not rise fully, and the days passed in a dim gray and never became gold, the people of the north did not expect clarity. Runes were not just letters. They were not scribbles of ink meant to fill a page. And though no rune could summon warmth where the fire had failed, or call forth game from a silent forest, they brought a kind of steadiness. In these same nights, when the fire softened to embers and sleep crept in with the weight of exhaustion, dreams came like messengers with bare feet. Not all were welcome. Some dreams unsettled. Others arrived with an air of comfort, wrapping the sleeper in memories so vivid they carried the scent of last summer's grass or the sound of a voice long gone. Following old paths, crossing snowfields, climbing into the branches of Yggdrasil the world tree to glimpse what the waking mind could not endure. Dreams were weighed carefully, not dissected but remembered. A dream of falling ice might signal a sickness yet to come. A white wolf standing in silence could be an omen, depending on where it looked or whether it looked at all. Not every dream was spoken aloud, but many were shared in hushed tones over morning broth, the details recounted as precisely as memory allowed, as though recounting the route of a real journey taken in another form. Not as ghosts with chains or terrible cries, but as presences. Forests held secrets. Stones were not empty. And snow was a canvas, a place where tracks told more than movement. When he was younger, he had laughed quietly at his cousin's fear of a shadow by the barn, or at the old woman's insistence that dreams could bring warnings. But now, after his own long nights on the fjord, after the gathering, after the quietness that had settled in his chest since the first deep snow, he listened differently. He found himself noticing small shifts, the way the fire hissed when he stepped near, how a knot in the wood above his bed seemed to change shape depending on the time of night. And he did not feel afraid. Where patterns might appear overnight, wind-written but meaningful. A fox's paws, a deer's zigzag, the melting trace of a single boot where no one had walked. Children were taught to look closely at these things, to ask, not aloud but inwardly, what moved here? What watched? In the pauses between chores, in the silence before sleep, a way of seeing, a way of being. They lived in the weight of cold air on skin, in the echo of one's own footsteps across hard-packed snow. It resists, not with violence, but with a kind of stubborn silence, a stillness that runs deep and ancient. To press a spade into it is to meet not soil, but as remembrance, a final tending by those whose hands had once passed bread or helped shoulder burdens. It was wrapped, not shrouded in finery, but in cloth that had meaning, the cloak worn during harvests, the belt passed down from a father, the brooch that had closed every winter's coat for 20 years. These were not offerings to the dead, but parts of their story woven into their final stillness. But stone wrapped in frost, ground that no longer yields willingly, ground that must be coaxed with fire and time. In the north, where the snow could linger for half the year, and the wind was older than any memory, death in winter was not simply a sorrow. In summer, the burial mounds rose smoothly, the soil shaped by careful hands into soft rises beneath sky and wind. But in winter, when even firewood was rationed, and every hour of labor came at the cost of warmth, digging became an act of devotion. Fires were lit over the chosen spot, great, crackling flames built not to warm the living, but to soften the grip of the earth. Stones were removed slowly, soil chipped away in frozen clumps. The process might take days. And during those days, the body remained not hidden, not feared, but present. Sometimes kept in an outer room, sometimes watched over through the night. Not embalmed, but preserved by the cold itself, the same cold that once hardened muscles, now keeping skin intact as if in sleep. It was a challenge, a negotiation with the frozen land that held fast to all things, even those meant to pass through it. And they taught, gently but firmly, that the world was never fully known, that something always waited beneath the surface, and that, perhaps, it was not meant to be understood, only respected. Not out of fear, and not only for grief, but out of a deep and reverent understanding that something sacred had shifted. Death was not foreign to the Norse. It was part of the rhythm, as natural as snowfall, as inevitable as the sun's slow return. But when it came in winter, when it arrived in the depth of night, when the doors were shut tight against the cold and the fires were guarded with care, it carried a different weight. It did not arrive with drama. It settled like snow falling steadily on a roof. The dead did not vanish in the Norse world. They lingered. They listened. And in the hush of winter, when the veil between the living and the gone grew thinner, they might return, not to haunt, but to be remembered. A dream might carry a grandfather's voice. A sudden breeze indoors might speak of an ancestor. Offerings were made not in fear, but in recognition. A bowl of broth left at the threshold. A name whispered into the fire. The Norse did not separate dreams from life with clean lines. A dream was not merely the mind's play. It was a visitation. Sometimes from gods, sometimes from the dead, sometimes from the self, revealed in a form not easily recognized. In extreme silence, the mind begins to hear other things. The creak of ancient timbers, the echo of stories told 100 times before, the subtle rhythm of one's own heartbeat slowed by stillness. This sensitivity was not feared. It was accepted. It was part of the season. The stars above him were unfamiliar, and the wind did not touch his skin. Across the ice walked a figure, tall and indistinct, wrapped in something that moved like smoke. The figure stopped, turned, and raised a hand, not in greeting or threat, but in acknowledgement. Thorold did not move, did not speak. But when he woke, the silence of the room felt different. The embers in the hearth glowed steadily. Outside, the snow had stopped, and something within him had settled, as though a thread had been tied between that dream and the waking world. And so the people remained attuned to sound, to sight, to the shifts in the atmosphere that told of something just beyond comprehension. It was believed that the soul could travel during sleep, that it might drift beyond the walls of the longhouse, and always there was the cold. It was more than sensation. In winter's depths, the cold became a lens, changing the way the world was seen and felt. It slowed the blood, thickened the air, brought a soft buzzing to the edge of hearing when breath was held too long. A long walk beneath pale stars could blur the difference between solitude and visitation. A flicker in the darkness might be smoke, or something else. The Norse did not call these illusions. They did not dismiss what could not be touched. They knew that perception was not a weakness, but a doorway. The cold tested the body, yes, but it also opened the spirit. It was in this space, where the known met the unknown without conflict, that spirits were most often felt. The spirits were not always human. The land itself breathed. Thorold had once dismissed such stories. He felt accompanied. Not watched, exactly, but not entirely alone. One night, he dreamt of standing at the edge of a frozen lake. He told no one. But that day, when he checked the traps, he whispered a thank you into the cold wind, not to a god, not to the air, but to whatever presence had walked beside him while he slept. And that is how it was in winter. The stories, the runes, the dreams, the spirits, they did not fight for belief. They did not demand. They existed in the quiet spaces. As the fire burned low once more, and Thorold wrapped his cloak tighter, he felt that respect, not as a rule, but as a rhythm. And in that rhythm, he drifted softly into sleep, accompanied not by fear, but by the quiet company of things unseen. The earth in winter is not easily opened. When someone died during the long months of darkness, the village grew quieter still. The body was prepared inside the home. It was washed, slowly and with silence, not as ritual alone, and then came the weight, because the ground would not open. Not easily, not without effort. In summer, the burial mounds rose smoothly, the soil shaped by careful hands into soft rises beneath sky and wind. But in winter, when even firewood was rationed, and every hour of labor came at the cost of warmth, digging became an act of devotion. Fires were lit over the chosen spot. Great, crackling flames built not to warm the living, but to soften the grip of the earth. Stones were removed slowly, soil chipped away in frozen clumps. A final blessing, a small token placed beside the body, a knife, a carved bead, a lock of hair. Then the earth was returned, layer by layer, as much stone and snow as soil. The mound was marked not always with a stone, but often with a memory, a direction faced, a tree planted nearby, a story begun with. He is buried where the three hills meet. But there was continuation. The bowl still passed. The traps still checked. The loom still spun. And yet, the absence was not hollow, but now it had come nearer. His uncle, who had taught him how to set a snare, had slipped while cutting wood during a storm and not returned. And when Thorold woke, the dream felt less like a message and more like a presence that had always been there, waiting for the moment to be seen. By the time they found him, the cold had made him still. And yet, in that stillness, there was no fear. It is the moment when one hand releases the cup and another takes it. The warmth of the fire passed from one face to the next. In spring, it would show first, the snow melting faster there, as if the ground remembered warmth. With footsteps into snow, with songs that did not end, only quieted into the silence between breaths. The air inside held not just warmth, but richness. And iron, its heat radiating outward in waves that touched even the furthest corners of the room. Wood burned steadily, fed not by scraps or branches, but by logs thick enough to last through the longest story. And beside the fire sat the Jarl's cup, carved from horn, rimmed with metal, filled not just with ale, but with memory, with the weight of decisions made and unspoken debts owed. The scent of spice, smoke, and slow-cooked meat clung to the rafters. Furs lined the benches, not just the thick pelts of local beasts, but the softer, more supple skins of animals brought from trade. Sable, ermine, even foxes, not of the native wood. On the high seat where the Jarl sat, the cushions were firm and full, wrapped in dyed cloths that bore the muted hues of distant dyes, madder red, woad blue, walnut brown. A palette not born of the northern soil, but carried by ships across seas most would never see. In summer, wild flowers would cluster around it, unplanted but somehow perfect. And always he would nod, not in grief, but in recognition. It was not dressed in gold or stone. It was made of the same timber, the same earth, drawn from the same forest that whispered around every village. But it rose wider, taller, its beams heavier, its roof steep and deep, like the back of a great beast hunched against the snow. From a distance, the smoke rising from its center was thicker, darker, the mark not only of heat, but of abundance. The door was flanked by carved posts, their shapes worn smooth by the years, but still clear enough to speak of power. Dragons, serpents, symbols that told not only of myth, but of mastery. This was a place where others came to listen, to offer, to be seen. And in winter, it became more than a seat of rule. It became a sanctuary from the world's quietest violence. the cold. Only a kind of deep quiet, a peace that held no anger. Thorold had helped carry him home, had helped strip the boots, warm the limbs too late to save. He had helped tend the fire that burned for hours over the frozen ground. It pools around fires, yes, but also around power, around position, around the silent privileges built not by weather or season, but by the long hands of lineage, land, and loyalty. And while the snow fell just as steadily outside every roof in the north, not all Viking homes felt its weight the same. There were those who huddled in the corners of modest longhouses, where wind found its way through the smallest cracks, where food was measured by the day and wood was rationed with care. And then there were the homes of the jarls, the chieftains, the stewards of land and people, whose halls stood larger, whose fires burned longer, whose tables bent with what others stored in reserve. The winter outside did not soften for them, but within those longhouses, winter became a different shape, not a hardship, but a season adorned. And he had stood beside the mound as it was closed, a hand on his father's shoulder, his breath rising slowly into the cold sky. It echoed gently through the routines, in the cup set aside, in the coat no longer lifted from the wall, in the story told with a pause before a name. The Norse did not believe the dead vanished. They believed in other halls, in Valhalla for the honored, in Helheim for those who went quietly. But they also believed in the nearness of those who had gone. That ancestors did not fade into mist, but stood just outside the circle of firelight, watching, waiting, sometimes whispering. The process might take days. And during those days, the body remained, not hidden, not feared, but present. Sometimes kept in an outer room, sometimes watched over through the night. The weight carried had shifted, not lightened, not darkened, but moved inward. The fire, when seen again from a distance, glowed like a promise made and kept. And as the door was opened, and the warmth met cold skin again, there was a deep, shared breath. The exhale of the living who had stood beside death and returned. Not embalmed, but preserved by the cold itself, the same cold that once hardened muscles, now keeping skin intact as if in sleep. These days of waiting were not idle. They were filled with the soft rituals of preparation, not with urgency, but with gravity. Stories were told, not about death, but about the life that had gone. The body was carried with care, often on a sled or litter made of planks, wrapped and bound tightly to keep the form whole. The procession was slow, not somber in the way that silence can be heavy, but steady, like walking behind an old rhythm. There might be music, a low hum, a drum beaten not to march but to mark the space. The wind did not pause, the snow did not hold back. But those who walked with the dead did not resist the world around them. They walked through it, letting the cold accompany them like a second shadow. Not as eulogy, but as memory. Laughter was not forbidden. Tears were not demanded. Everything was allowed to rise naturally, like steam from the hearth. Children sat near the elders, listening as they always had. And in these small gatherings, something larger than mourning took shape. A weaving of the departed back into the shared story. As if the person had not disappeared, but simply stepped into the part of the tale told in softer tones. When the grave was finally ready, it was not deep, it could not be, but it was enough. At the burial site, there were few speeches. Words were offered sparingly, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed saying had already been lived. And then, the return. The walk back to the longhouse was quieter than the walk out. In the days that followed, there was no forgetting. Thorold had not known death closely until that winter. He had seen it from afar, an old man from another farm, a child lost in early frost. That night, he dreamt of his uncle standing at the edge of the forest, not speaking, just watching, as if to say, "You did well." In the seasons that followed, he would walk past that mound many times. Because in the north, where the cold holds everything tightly for so long, death is not an interruption. It is a continuation. And so, even in winter, especially in winter, the Norse honored the dead not with fear, but with firelight. Even in the coldest places, warmth gathers in different ways. The Jarl's Hall was not a palace. Stepping into the Jarl's longhouse was not unlike stepping into another layer of winter, one where the outside seemed to melt from memory. The hearth was vast. Not a single trench fire, but a great pit lined with stone. Not a single trench fire, but a great pit lined with stone and iron, its heat radiating outward in waves that touched even the furthest corners of the room. Wood burned steadily, fed not by scraps or branches, but by logs thick enough to last through the longest story. Where the farmer might ladle thin broth thickened only by root and grain, the Jarl's table offered smoked meats, rich porridge, cured fish laced with herbs. Bread, fresh baked when grain allowed, shared with visiting dignitaries or warband captains whose loyalty had been shaped in salt and blade. Jars of fermented honey drink mead sat near the walls, their sides crusted with the sticky memory of summer's sweetness. Someone was always stirring, a servant tending the flames, a guard sharpening a blade, a voice murmuring in a side chamber. During the day, messengers arrived with news of distant holdings. Traders offered tokens from the south, and skalds, poets, recited tales both commissioned and remembered. Once, to deliver a package from his father, salted meat owed as part of a long-standing agreement. He ate slowly, carefully, watching the way others moved, how bread was passed, how the youngest servants watched for the slightest gesture. And when the skald stood to speak, Thorold listened not just with ears, but with the whole of him. The story was of an ancestor, not of the Jarl, but of a farmer who had saved a warband by hiding them in hay during a raid. A reminder, perhaps, that greatness was not always born of inheritance. And for the farmer in the Viking North, these were not poetic stillnesses. They were the quiet descent into the lean season, when the world grew narrower with every frostbitten dawn. While the longhouses of Jarls hummed with visitors and feasting, in the hills and valleys beyond, the hum was softer, lower, broken only by the creak of roof beams under snow and the slow breath of animals sleeping in their stalls. The long season did not come suddenly. It crept in like mist across frozen fields, and the people who worked the land had learned to watch for it, not in the clouds, but in the sound of the grain sack being opened just a little more slowly each morning. And again, to listen. The invitation had come through a cousin who served in the household. No reason was given. Every root, every slice of meat, every scrap of cloth became a decision. The larder, once full from autumn's labor, began to thin like the light itself. The dried fish, strung in tidy rows at harvest's end, were counted not in dozens, but in days. The vegetables, shriveled, resilient, clinging to their last moisture, were tucked deeper into straw to prevent rot. Cheese, once shared freely at Yule, was now portioned into thinner wedges. Butter grew faint. Ale ran cloudy. The feast had passed, and now the careful watching began. But when Thorold stepped through the great doorway, he felt not welcomed, but measured, not judged, but observed. Because it was not wealth that kept winter at bay. Like a reminder that even the highest seat sits beneath the same sky, and that the snow falls, quietly, steadily, on every roof. It was attention. It was care. It was the breath of those who knew how to listen, how to endure, how to pass the warmth of one generation into the hands of the next. The firelight caught his face, and he stood straighter without meaning to. Music was not constant, but it lived here more freely, the strings of the lyre plucked by practiced hands, the rhythms of drums echoing softly like distant footsteps on frozen ground. And fruit, dried in season, rehydrated slowly in warm liquid, appeared as a luxury almost mythic in the heart of winter. He thought of the silence behind the stories, of how even in that vast, warm hall, Where fire burned without question and bread came without hesitation, the cold still waited outside. That the wind did not care who sat nearest the hearth. That beneath every cloak, every brooch, every carved beam, people were still people. Still listening for the turning of the year, still hoping the fire would last. All of this laid not to dazzle, but to reassure. Here, in this hall, the cold would not consume. And beside the fire sat the Jarl's cup, carved from horn, rimmed with metal, filled not just with ale, but with memory, with the weight of decisions made and unspoken debts owed. Meals here were not constant feasts, but they bore the mark of plenty. But it was not food or fire alone that marked the difference. To sit beneath a roof that stood as proof that power could protect. To be reminded, perhaps, that while winter was impartial, society was not. The Jarl himself was rarely loud. His authority lived in quiet things, in the nod that summoned attention, in the pause between words that made the hall lean forward, in the way his presence carved space around him like wind carving stone. He was not feared like a king, nor loved like a hero. He was necessary. A fixed point in the turning of the season. It was sound. The Jarl's longhouse never truly fell silent, not even in the deepest hour of night. The people gathered here not just to seek shelter, but to bear witness. Thorold had entered the Jarl's longhouse only twice that winter. He was offered a seat near the middle, not close enough to the high seat to suggest favor, but not distant enough to forget. That night, as Thorold walked home through snow softened by moonlight, he did not think of wealth, or power, or the feel of fur beneath his hand. And though his own longhouse was smaller, its roof lower, its fire dimmer, it was no less a place of strength. Inside the Jarl's longhouse, winter was held at arm's length, but it was never forgotten. It pressed against the walls like memory. There are winters when time itself seems to stretch thin, as though the days no longer pass so much as pause, suspended between cold and colder, hunger and memory. To be a farmer during the deep winter was to become a steward of what remained. Every root, every slice of meat, every scrap of cloth became a decision. The larder, once full from autumn's labor, began to thin like the light itself. The cows huddled in a corner of the longhouse or in low sheds made of stone and earth, their breath rising in soft clouds that curled along the ceiling. The frozen ground offered no invitation. The fields lay sleeping, cloaked in snow, with only the thin stalks of last year's barley showing through like brittle ribs. Tools were repaired, not used. Ropes were rebraided. Nets were mended by the fire, more out of habit than immediate need. But to share the work of counting what was left, had come to understand the difference between the longhouse of plenty and the longhouse of patience. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and blinking in the deep blue cold. The snow glittered faintly, unbothered by footprints. And he stood there, not thinking of hunger or luxury or of the feasts he had once imagined himself at. The others had already gone to sleep, their breathing slow and warm under woven blankets. Thorold added a piece of wood, careful not to wake them, and watched the flames catch with the quiet resolve of one who had learned something without needing it explained. But of the steadiness behind him, the slow, methodical labor of those who had never sought glory, only continuity. Beneath the great timbers of the north, in the long shadows that stretched across snow-packed yards and dim chambers, and always fleeting, is to come closer to the life of a servant in the cold months. Thralls and laborers did not rest beside the central hearth, and the structure pressed hardest on the shoulders of those without name. In sagas, warriors walked into legend with blades drawn and hair wild with ice. But the woman who scrubbed their tunics in frozen water, the boy who gathered branches in the blue half-light of morning, toes numbing in sodden shoes, they guarded supplies against wolves. They stamped their feet beside doors that creaked open. They watched candles burn low and ensured they would not catch on fur or thatch. They were the keepers of unspoken promises, that the animals would be fed, the food would be stirred, the snow would be swept away before the master's boots found it. And in doing so, they touched every part of the longhouse's life, though they remained apart from it. They are there, just outside the frame, kneeling beside a pail, bent beneath the yoke, their breath rising in plumes that vanished before acknowledgement. They slept along the outer edges, near the doors, the smoke holes, the places where drafts crept in like unwelcome spirits. If there was a blanket, it was often shared. They knew that snow did not favor the powerful, that frost made no exception, that the night was long for prince and pawn alike. But for them, the night was not just long, it was layered. Beneath the ache of cold was the sharper ache of invisibility. To serve is one thing. To disappear while doing so is another. And yet, they carried water, they stitched, they milked. They kept the rhythm of the household steady, even when their own hearts beat beneath thinner cloth and beside smaller fires. If there was a cloak, it had once belonged to someone else, patched, faded, and handed down not as kindness, but as economy. Lived the quiet burden of those rarely named the thralls of the north, who bore their winters not in family, but in servitude. His mother had answered without malice, because she learned not to. It wasn't cruelty, it was the reality of a world built in layers, where some spoke and others only listened, where the snow fell evenly, but the warmth was not so democratic. And yet, sometimes, on the longest nights, when the winds howled loudest, even the masters grew quiet. And in those moments, the line blurred. The servant stoked the fire. The child of the house shivered and nestled beside them, unthinking of status. And for a few heartbeats, the hierarchy melted, softened by cold, by necessity, by breath shared in darkness. And though their names were seldom written down, and though their hands were not praised in sagas, it was through their endurance that the great machines of Viking life turned, especially when the cold bit deepest, who rose every day into the same chill and made the same quiet promise. We will get through this too. Here, there were no brooches, no imported furs. Only wool, patched many times. Only cloaks that smelled of smoke and straw. Yet the feeling inside this home was not lesser. It was, in some ways, deeper. The silence between the adults was not born of weariness, but of understanding. There, smoke gathered in the rafters, and frost claimed the corners. Even the floor beneath them was harder. Even the silence was colder. But the cold did not wait for permission. It settled in bones regardless of status. And so these uncelebrated souls met it not with complaint, but with motion. They rose earlier. They worked longer. They were the first to the snow-covered well, and the last to bed when the coals dimmed to ash. They chopped the wood that warmed others. They fed the animals before feeding themselves. They stirred the pots whose scent promised nourishment that might pass them by. The looks passed between them were filled with a language built over years of shared hardship, the kind of communication that needs no embellishment, only presence. Someone stirred the pot, someone checked the stores, someone mended the shoes worn through by frost and labor. It was not a place of longing, it was a place of enduring. And the fire, though smaller now, still danced. And in that stillness, Thorold felt a kind of awe, not for grandeur, but for grit, for the strength it took to ration a single loaf over a week, for the love that made a mother give her portion to a child without ceremony, for the care with which a grandfather stitched a worn glove for the 7th time, so that the boy tending the traps might have fingers that could still feel, still gave its modest warmth to those who asked nothing more of it than to burn. The younger children asked fewer questions. They played nearer the hearth, sensing the way voices had dropped, how laughter became a rare thing, not because joy had vanished, but because energy had become too precious to spend on anything but necessity. The pigs rooted less. The goats moved only when necessary. Their feed, too, was dwindling. Hay packed tightly in lofts slowly gave way to dust. Turnips set aside for the animals were now split between them and the table. A sick animal was not just a loss. It was a breach in the rhythm of survival. And so the farmers watched them closely, rubbed their flanks, warmed their water, murmured to them when the wind howled through the cracks. The dried fish, strung in tidy rows at harvest's end, were counted not in dozens, but in days. The vegetables, shriveled, resilient, clinging to their last moisture, were tucked deeper into straw to prevent rot. Cheese, once shared freely at Yule, was now portioned into thinner wedges. Butter grew faint, ale ran cloudy. The feast had passed, and now the careful watching began. Livestock, once proud in the pasture, now stood motionless in makeshift shelters. The chores became quieter, slower, more inward. Meals, once spoken of in terms of flavor, now revolved around endurance. The broth became thinner, more water than substance, seasoned not with meat, but with memory. The crust of bread was split 3 ways instead of 2. Bones were boiled twice, then dried and crushed into powder to thicken the next day's gruel. And yet, there was no despair in this. Only focus, only care. The lean season demanded attention, and the farmers met it not with complaint, but with discipline, a quiet strength passed down from hands that had done this before and would do it again. Each evening brought the same ritual. A small fire was kindled, and around it the family gathered, not to speak of dreams or distant places. Thorald visiting his uncle's farm for a few days to help with the chopping of ice and the mending of fences half buried in snow one night. After a simple supper of root mash and fish scraped from the edge of spoil, Thorald stepped outside. The wind was light that night, brushing the bare trees with a hush of breath. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. And inside the longhouse, when he returned, the fire was still lit, flickering softly beneath the pot, casting orange shadows on the timber-bird walls. Because in that room, beneath that roof, he had seen what it meant to live not with more, but with less, done well. And that, too, was a kind of wealth. If the flickering hearth within the farmer's longhouse offered warmth through patience, then the corners beyond that, warmth beyond even the reach of kin-held stories, seldom spoken aloud. To imagine a Norse winter without fire is impossible. But to imagine it with only the scraps of firelight unclaimed, unfavored, their shelters, when separate from the master's household, were little more than huts of earth and timber, pressed against the landscape like afterthoughts. The weight of winter lay not only in the snow, but in the structure of daily life. But still they endured. And within that endurance was a quiet kind of knowing deeper than bitterness, older than rebellion. In the coldest weeks, some thralls were tasked with standing watch, not to protect, but to preserve. Thorald, now older, once asked his mother why the thrall woman in their hall never looked anyone in the eye. His mother had answered without malice, because she learned not to. It wasn't cruelty. It was the reality of a world built in layers, where some spoke, but the world survived because of them. Their breath steamed over the mouths of babies, not their own. They whispered lullabies, brought from places far from the fjords, songs half remembered from mothers who had once sung them in languages long lost to the snow. These thralls and servants carried not just loads and water and firewood. They went on mending, gathering, pouring, feeding, and the world turned again, lifted quietly by hands that rarely paused, and feet that rarely warmed, and hearts that rarely hoped for thanks. In the depth of a Norse winter, when daylight shrank into slivers, not who one ruled or owned, but whether one could keep the fire alive. In this stripped-down clarity, a cultural truth emerged, slow and steady like a thawing stream. We are stronger when we endure together. And in that unspoken agreement, in that quiet understanding, forged not by oath. In the storm, it was not strength that protected the weak, but cooperation that protected all. Neighbors, even rivals, traded food when stores ran low. Songs were not entertainment, but lifelines binding people to something larger, older, unbroken. Thor's strength was balanced by the cleverness of Loki. The pantheon itself was not solitary. It was a web, much like the villages below, each figure contributing, failing, supporting. And in these myths, whispered into ears half asleep beside flickering flames, children learned that even gods needed others. They lit candles, they sang. They played games that taught lessons. They told stories that bound one generation to the next. They repaired what was broken, preserved what was precious, and above all, remembered that they were not alone. That even in Asgard, strength was a shared thing. It was a teacher. That strength is not dominance, but endurance. That culture is not loud, but persistent. That the deepest bonds are forged not in celebration, but in shared struggle. And so, the longhouses of the north, warmed not only by fire but by presence, became places of sacred continuity. Each heartbeat, each whisper, each bowl passed from one hand to the next, keeping time with the rhythm of life. Even silence, that vast presence that lives between winter winds, was shared. Not because it erased winter, but because it confirmed that they had made it through. All of them. And though their roles differed, though their beds and meals and fates were not equal, their story was shared. Stitched into cloaks, etched into walls, carried in song, passed through time. Again, it was the shaping of wooden spoons beside iron blades. It was the laughter of drunk uncles beside the chants of seers. It was the endurance of the woman who gave birth during snowfall, the boy who trapped hares with frost-bitten fingers, the old man who hummed to himself while mending a sled for the 100th time. None of these lives were written into stone, but all were carved into the soul of a people. People knew how to sit beside each other and simply listen to fire, to wind, to memory. But by repetition, the Viking people wove their spirit, not just in sagas, but in every layered day that passed beneath snow-laden skies. What one had in surplus, another had already used. The man who butchered the deer might not have built the sled. The woman who spun the wool might not have caught the fish. But all relied on one another like the branches of an evergreen, each distinct. In burial mounds, warriors were laid beside combs and bowls and cloth fragments of the life they'd lived among others. To be remembered was to be part of the whole. To be honored, not just for strength, but for one's place in the circle. And in that circle, there was room for many. For the stoic, for the storyteller, for the child who learned to count the stars when days refused to appear, but reaching together toward warmth, toward spring, toward the quiet promise that they would all make it through. And the wind howled like wolves in chorus. Divisions faded under a thicker truth. Survival was a shared endeavor. And so, though the north was carved into lines of hierarchy and wealth, the ice carved something different, an identity, born not from politics or conquest, but from the shared hum of breath inside frozen walls. But winter blurred these lines like breath on a window pane. When the cold settled in, it asked the same question of all. Will you survive this night? And in answering, again and again, with axes swung into frozen trees, with fish hung in cold smoke, with children pressed into woolen folds beside old stories, the people of the north whispered a single, soft reply. We will endure. Together. Strength in the storm did not belong to one person, nor to one class. It belonged to all who endured. They carried fragments of cultures broken and repurposed. They braided stories into the work of their fingers. And even if no one asked, those stories lived. And others only listened, where the snow fell evenly, but the warmth was not so democratic. It was not owned. It was tended, shared, guarded. The child of the chieftain warmed hands beside the same blaze as the guest, the stranger, even the servant. The same stew passed from ladle to bowl, from mother to child, from hand to hand as the night lengthened beyond reckoning. There was no spectacle to it, no grand show of unity, but something stronger. A ritual of necessity, repeated so often it became identity. That you were Viking not by birth alone, but by your place in this shared winter rhythm. That you had stood through the freeze, and stirred the broth, and sung the old songs, not to perform, but to remember. And yet, sometimes, on the longest nights, when the winds howled loudest, even the masters grew quiet. A scrap of cloth was placed over the eyes. A name, perhaps whispered only once, was spoken to the night air. Others were born into bondage and knew no other rhythm. But all of them moved through winter with the same urgent grace as falling snow soft, almost unnoticed, but covering everything. And the fire, that ever-hungry witness, flickered on. And in those moments, the line blurred. The servant stoked the fire. The child of the house shivered and nestled beside them, unthinking of status. And for a few heartbeats, the hierarchy melted, softened by cold, by necessity, by breath shared in darkness. The sagas did not celebrate them. Their hands churned butter when the churn froze shut. Their backs bent over pots when the broth thickened with ice. When one among them died, it was not with the funeral of a warrior, nor the mourning of kin. But still, someone wept. Still, someone remembered. Not all thralls remained so. Some, with time and favor, found their freedom. And when spring finally came, and the river cracked open like an old wound healing, and the sun climbed a little higher in the sky, the servants did not stop to celebrate. Yet they were part of it all, the unseen roots beneath the tree of Norse life, anchoring it, feeding it, holding it steady while the storm passed above. The snow did not choose sides. It fell evenly, quietly, relentlessly over longhouses and lean-tos, on the cloaks of jarls and the bare heads of thralls. When the cold came, it stripped life down to its simplest terms. The fire in the longhouse was a center, yes, but it was not a throne. It is easy, perhaps, to imagine the Norse world only through the lens of different kings and commoners, warriors and farmers, the elite and the enslaved. And so, community was not simply a luxury, it was armor. What one person lacked in muscle, another brought in wisdom. Even the gods, in their great northern halls, seemed to reflect this truth. Odin did not rule alone, he listened to ravens. And what was culture, if not this web? It was the weaving of many voices into one long thread. Even the dead did not stand alone. So when the wind screamed against the thatch, when the snow buried fences and paths, and even the sun itself, the Norse did not wait in terror. Winter, for them, was not just a season. And it taught them this, that survival is not glory, but quiet cooperation. And when spring finally arrived, not in sudden triumph, but in shy gestures, a drip of melting icicles, the first sprout pushing through thawed soil, it was greeted not with noise, but with reverence. And the people knew they had been shaped by the storm, not as conquerors of winter, but as those who endured it, together. And so now, as your thoughts settle like snowflakes on the surface of still water, and the breath in your chest rises and falls in the rhythm of firelight, we come gently to the close of this long northern journey. You've walked across the frozen fjords in the footsteps of Thorold, felt the brittle breath of a winter, wind threading through the scenes of wool and fur. And yet, perhaps not so far. For even in your silence now, there are echoes of their ways. A kettle murmuring on a modern stove is not unlike the cauldron that simmered over the communal hearth. Not a silence of fear, but of conclusion. Children bundled into the arms of woolen sleep, elders murmuring final thoughts into the stillness, the fire reduced to its softest glow, like the last word in a poem. We remember them not for the swords they raised, but for the candles they lit, for the warmth they passed hand to hand, breath to breath, generation to generation. Outside, the snow fell without sound. Inside, Hearts beat in harmony with the old, unchanging truth that even the longest night has its song. The soft padding of your feet across a quiet room resembles the steps they took on frozen floors. That fire is sacred. That stories hold power. That the dead walk with the living in winter's hush. That the darkness is not empty, but full of dreams of spirits of the past pressing gently against the present. These are not superstitions. They are remembrances, folded into language, into custom, into sleep itself. And the stories these stories remain, bridging centuries not by volume but by presence. And heard the ancient songs echoing across the smoke-dark rafters of the great hall. Let the breath soften. Let the thoughts unravel like a woolen thread in slow wind. The storm is past. The walls are strong. The stories have been told. And all around you, the hush of snow and time. They lived with the cold. They moved inside it like fish in a current, like stars beneath a night so clear it could not possibly be forgotten. The long exhale after effort, the comfort of shelter, the companionship of memory. Maybe you see that winter is not a villain, but a mirror. And in its stillness, we remember what matters: presence, patience, preparation, and each other. The cold did not erase their joy. It did not mute their voices. It gave them rhythm. It gave them ritual. In how you face the unknown. In how you care for others. In how you endure when things are cold within or without. And when warmth returns, as it always does, you carry the knowledge that you made it through. Like them, and like them, you are not alone. It gave them the shape of their days, the pulse of their songs, the architecture of their memory. And what they left behind is more than wood and iron. It is the silent strength of people who knew how to live where life had to be kindled each day like flame from flint. You've sat quietly beside the long-dead fire of a farmer, glimpsed the fleeting smile of a thrall in the shadows of labor, and traced the runes left by hands now folded in the soil of centuries. And through it all, you have rested in the company of a people who knew winter not as an enemy to conquer, but as a teacher to endure. There is a strange kind of warmth in that the way memory and hardship, when bound together over time, create something more than mere survival. They form a culture, not loud or boastful, but steady as the roots of the fir trees beneath the snow. The Norse people, though often remembered through the bladed romance of raids and ships and gods, were at their core something much quieter. They were guardians of rhythm, keepers of fire, whisperers of myth, singers of the long dark. They endured not only through strength of arm, but through the constancy of preparation, the intimacy of community, and the belief that each winter past was not simply a challenge, but a thread in the long weaving of time. It's easy now, wrapped perhaps in a soft blanket, tucked within walls that keep the wind at bay, to feel far from their world. You see, the Vikings did not simply not freeze. They did not just avoid death by cunning or by chance. As you drift now, perhaps half in waking, half in dreaming, imagine the hush that came upon the longhouses as night thickened around them. There are things the Norse believed that even time has not worn away, and so we remember them not as warriors only, but as listeners, as weavers of moments, as watchers of stars through roof beams. In this way, the story continues. And maybe now, as your own night deepens and your limbs loosen their hold on the day, you feel a little of that rhythm too. The Norse winter lives not just in snow-packed valleys or ancient sagas, but in the quiet strength you carry into your own life. So now, let the fire burn low. Sleep well, traveler. The night is long, but you are warm, and you are home.